Reborn. Evolving from Nothing. Chapters 221 to 230. Chapter 221. King Class. Dorian settled down, his clawed feet digging into the rock as he planted himself opposite of the giant and the Goron ice waterfall. The air around him seemed electric, the various laws he was using giving off a powerful and demonic aura. The giant, throughout all of this, didn't slow down. As it dashed through Issachar, it obliterated dozens of buildings, creating a storm of rock and ice. Graycon bodies were constantly sent flying, not a single one of them able to halt the creature. Without the Graycon king that used to be here, they were essentially helpless. In just a few scant seconds, it arrived. Boom! The giant had eyes for only him, ignoring everything else. It attacked the moment it got in range, swinging its huge blade out to the right and cutting in from the side. The sword tore a huge gouge in the earth, smashing up the rocky ground as it slashed towards Dorian extremely quickly. The shrapnel from the blow scattered up into the air, forming a small cloud of debris. In his enhanced state, with the foresight and knowledge that it was going to attack him, Dorian was able to react this time. He did that by jumping up into the air. Whoosh! The huge blade passed beneath him, ripping up the ground but missing him by a solid dozen meters. Right after that, the middle of the blade collided with the Goron ice waterfall. Shhhhhkkk. As soon as the blade made contact, a screeching sound echoed out. A mass of ice formed over the middle of the blade, spreading out a good dozen meters. The magical Goron ice wrapped around and fell over the blade, shivering. When this happened, the blade's momentum vanished and it stayed frozen in the air. The giant stumbled forward slightly, its feet shaking the earth. Its head turned to stare at the frozen blade. It then began to pull on it, a raw, king-class aura blasting outward as it tugged with all its might. Creak. The blade shifted slightly. At the same time, however, the Goron ice waterfall reacted violently as well. The magical ice that distorted the air seemed to object to the movement, and a huge stream diverted from the main flow, splashing all the way up to the hilt of the blade. The Goron ice waterfall was not a being and the reaction was not a conscious one. Rather, it seemed to be a built-in reaction to anything interfering with the waterfall's state. Immediately, the entire blade all the way up to the hilt was covered in a huge chunk of extremely solid ice. The frozen mass spread over past the hilt and onto the giant's lone arm, solidifying and preventing it from letting go. When the giant saw this, its aura flushed out even more powerfully. Slowly, the ice began to melt off as the powerful king-class cutting aura whittled away at it. The stream of Goron ice had only shot out only briefly as a reaction. The waterfall had already returned back to its normal state. Lacking the Goron ice's influence, the mass of ice wasn't able to put up any defense. Of course, as all of this happened, Dorian wasn't just standing still. The moment he saw the blade become trapped, he knew his plan had worked. An evil-looking grin appeared on his face, made worse by his demonic appearance. Dorian's perception of time slowed as both his perfect body ability and law of lust flared. His muscles bulged as, the moment he landed, he crouched down, concentrating all of his strength into his legs. Boom! The ground beneath him exploded as he leapt off it, forming a crater due to the amount of force behind his jump. He shot through the air like a bullet, racing towards the one-armed giant with abandon. It took him around a second to reach the height of the giant's shoulder. The giant was aware of him this entire time. Its urgent efforts to free its arm and blade showed that as it slowly turned its head to stare at him. "Sorry, friend." Dorian's words were accompanied by him raising both of his hands. Immediately, 52 more Hyperion beams formed in the air, infused with black flames. It took him only a fraction of a second to form them. In that split moment, Dorian could see the giant's eyes close up. They gave off a subtle glow of blue light. Its head was huge, far larger than he was. For a single moment, the two stood frozen in time. That moment ended. Dorian's combined Hyperion beam shot directly towards the giant's face, and then pierced through it. Boom! An explosion of light flashed out as the giant was near instantly killed, its consciousness destroyed. Its skull cracked and then shattered, its body collapsing as it lost the power to move of its own accord. It rapidly slumped down, held up only by the blade that was frozen in the Goron ice waterfall. Dorian was flung backwards from the shockwave. However, before he hit the ground, he transformed into his sun eagle form, allowing himself to fly freely. I need to absorb its soul spell matrix. The only thought on his mind was one of small urgency as he rushed forward, flapping his wings without hesitation. A small trail of flames fizzled out behind him as he shot forward and landed on the shoulder of the dead giant. Absorb. The moment Dorian arrived, he was able to sense the presence of the creature's rapidly vanishing soul. He took that time to immediately absorb the remnant soul spell matrix. He would be able to keep the soul spell matrix intact for use, while still also copying down all the information and taking in a large amount of growth energy. And, as expected, growth energy rushed into Dorian's soul, a huge torrent gained from defeating the king-class giant. At the same time, Dorian was able to notice something different. When it came to Lord-class desiccated beings, he was unable to absorb a complete soul spell matrix from them. However, when it was a king-class desiccated being, that rule didn't seem to apply. Perhaps it had something to do with their full comprehension of a law. Even if the power of their soul was limited, it seemed that their soul spell matrix was complete enough to function fully. As a result of that, Dorian was able to fully absorb almost everything. Giant bloodline obtained. Osra's cool, mechanical voice echoed softly in his head as Dorian felt a new line of knowledge appear. Yes, he couldn't help but grin, a feeling of victory arising. He didn't plan on growing the giant bloodline fully till after he was all done with his business here, but grabbing the bloodline successfully was still important. It was an immensely powerful bloodline, after all. Right after that, he sent Orsa a mental question. Osra, is this soul spell matrix I absorbed enough to help me form the Empyrean vampire form? He waited patiently. Osra was silent for a moment before replying. Yes, it is likely sufficient material. If you make use of the giant's corpse in front of you, it should provide a 100% guarantee of success. The bones? I need to absorb its body? Dorian muttered out loud, looking down at the huge creature. The shoulder he was standing on, alone, was much bigger than many buildings back on Earth. The latent energy in its body, and the energy signatures left behind, will be used up. The corpse itself will stay as it is, though with the energy from it removed, it should dissipate soon after. Given the conditions of the environment around you, it may remain frozen for an extended period, however. Osra gave a rather clear response. All right, I want to do it, right now. Dorian nodded his head as he sat down, crossing his legs atop the giant's shoulder. Absorb everything you need and let's go. His eyes flashed. Evolve me. 2 days later, the city of Issachar had restored itself to its former state, before the one-armed giant and Dorian wrecked large tracts of it. The magic curse that controlled these lands restored all damage to the area over a number of hours, reconstructing everything. Greycons continued to patrol the city in seemingly endless numbers as they went about their regular patrol, back and forth covering the land. The freezing cold that covered this world continued on its path, unimpeded. At the center of Issachar, however, stood something that had never been. The corpse of a huge, frozen one-armed giant that was sealed in a thick layer of ice. The giant's arm was stuck out, the massive blade that it wielded still frozen in the middle of the waterfall of Gwaran ice, unmoving. On the shoulder of this giant's corpse stood an elegant, handsome figure. It was a man with lustrous, white hair that ran down his shoulders, a lean, but muscular physique, and red pupils that gleamed ominously in the cold air. This man gave off a feeling of complete control and majesty, of absolute power, the air of a ruler. He was dressed in a set of slim black slacks and an elegant, silk gray shirt. This figure was Dorian. Ah! Dorian took a deep breath, his eyes glowing as he looked at the world around him. That went well, he smiled. After he absorbed the giant's soul spell matrix and immediately tapped on Osra to help him evolve, the evolution process began. It was a rather unique undertaking. Osra's cool touch helped guide everything as he absorbed energy from the bones of the enormous, undead creature, drawing upon the remnant essence of the fallen giant. He then combined that with the soul spell matrix he had absorbed. The energy was mixed up in hundreds of different ways, with dozens of strands of energy tying various things together. Then, Osra helped guide an even more complex process using these things to combine with various bloodlines he had absorbed, forming a massive experimental creation, all within his soul spell matrix. Such a thing would be very dangerous for any creature to do. For Asra, however, it came off as something that took just a few minutes of calculation, her work guaranteeing him a 100% success rate. While the calculations only took a few minutes, the actual evolution and combination of bloodlines took a very large amount of time. It seemed upgrading his soul spell matrix to king class without actually having reached a full understanding of any law had put a large burden on him, and, as a result, the evolution had to happen slowly. He had adopted a meditative pose, focused purely on the upgrade. He was aware of his surroundings and could pause it at any time, meaning he wasn't helpless, but he opted to get it all done in one shot. And, after 2 days, he successfully became an Empyrean vampire and his soul spell matrix reached king class. Shift, he spoke aloud. Immediately, the space before him trembled. A visible distortion formed in the air as Dorian casually waved his hand. This distortion was shaped like a solid, meter-by-meter block. Dorian flicked his wrist to the right. Immediately, this block of frozen air rushed sideways. A small gust of wind burst out around Dorian as it bashed to the right before freezing again, all at his command. He smiled and waved his hand again, releasing it. This was the void control ability he'd picked up from the Empyrean vampire. It was a powerful ability that gave him an inborn control of the world around him, able to use his will to manipulate it. When he combined this with his law of envy, a law that focused on spatial manipulation, his powers when it came to controlling space became substantial. Asra, show me the description of the Empyrean vampire bloodline again. He mentally commanded. Empyrean vampire, king class, early, maximum energy level, 312,820. Ability: void control, black luster, blood sense, constant regeneration, bat transformation, blood contract, demonic eyes, exuberant grace. Empyrean vampires are a previously unknown species that arose as a result of a mutation of the ancestral vampire line, bearing a very similar appearance to regular vampires, with a lean physique, white hair, and dark red eyes. The strongest possible form a vampire can grow into, Empyrean vampires have precise control over the world around them, able to manipulate space with their will, forming invisible barriers or attacking with invisible blows. They are protected by a powerful layer of black energy, shielding them from injury. Empyrean vampires are naturally graceful and can transform into a discrete bat form, can form contracts with lesser vampires, have enhanced vision, and enhanced regeneration. They are the natural rulers of the vampire race. Dorian looked it over. Apart from the void control ability, most of the other abilities were ones he already had. One in particular, however, was not. The black luster ability. After he glanced at it, he could feel how the power worked in his head. A near-invisible flicker of light covered Dorian as a layer of black energy appeared on his skin. The energy was near formless, only clinging to his body at an extremely fine level. He nodded as he felt it. It seems to be a direct upgrade to my mystic armored body ability. A passive protective power. I might as well use this one now. Keeping both abilities active was pointless. Only one of them could be used at a time due to their unique functions. After gathering his bearings, Dorian let out a laugh. He had finally reached king class. Chapter 222 impending. Dorian felt as if he had experienced a rebirth. The world around him felt clearer, his senses were expanded, and he had become stronger. Much stronger. Dorian called up his status. Dorian, soul status, soul stage. King class, incomplete. Health. Perfect. Energy. 2003, 922,018,800 2 million? My energy level has reached 2 million? When Dorian saw the statistics, his jaw dropped. It was an incredible gain. Most early-stage king-class experts had an energy rating of around 500,000. With a rating of a bit more than 2 million, Dorian had become a true blue powerhouse among the king class. While his Empyrean vampire form did boost his base strength a large amount, it was Dorian's abnormally powerful soul exploding forth with strength as soon as he hit king class that resulted in the largest direct increase in power. That increase was a result of the huge number of laws he trained in as well as the constant increases in power to his base soul, vastly boosting his energy beyond expectations. With this much energy, and a king-class soul spell matrix, Dorian's overall power had jumped significantly. The number of Hyperion beams he could handle, the power behind his blows, the amount of law energy he could use, everything would go up because of this. With all of his abilities and the multitude of laws he could access, Dorian had instantly become one of the most powerful king-class experts in the 30,000 worlds. It says, incomplete, as my stage? He frowned as he saw that. After a moment, however, he understood. His soul spell matrix had reached king class. He was inarguably at the king class. However, the only normal way to reach king class was to completely master and understand a law. Dorian had not done this. Because of this, he was both at the king class and also not at the king class. No matter how strong his soul got, he would always be stuck as a sort of fake king class state until he mastered a law to completion. Still, Dorian grinned, feeling ridiculously pleased. He clenched his fists, feeling an incredible sensation of strength. With power like this, no, it's not enough. He cut off his thoughts, his eyes flashing as he called something else to mind. Laws progress. Virtuous laws, 4/7. Demonic laws, 7/7. Law of original sin 7%. My body and soul have become truly powerful. Now it's time to increase my understanding of my laws. He nodded sharply. He couldn't let himself slack off. Dorian could sense that, despite the fact that he had reached king class, it was still possible to increase the base power of his soul. For regular king class experts, the maximum strength of their soul was limited by how powerful their soul was when they reached completion and broke into the king class. Dorian, however, was an exception, due to the multitude of laws he possessed, as well as the unique way he reached king class in the first place. Dorian looked over at the magical waterfall of Gwar and ice. His body shifted as he transformed back into his balanced demon form. While his Empyrean vampire form was now his strongest body, his balanced demon form was still the best for meditation on the laws of the universe. He took a few steps forward, over to the edge of the giant's shoulder. He then stepped onto its arm, his feet crunching on a thick layer of ice. He looked back at the frozen shoulder, a small smile forming. I suppose you could say I was standing on the shoulder of giants. Well, at least a giant, anyway, ha ha ha. He couldn't help himself as he thought up an old, rather famous saying from Earth. He shook the merriment away as he walked forward onto the ice, moving till he reached an optimal position. His balanced demon form could handle the brutal cold far better than it could the overwhelming heat of Taprish's molten core. Once he reached a spot close enough to the Gwar and ice waterfall, he sat down and began to meditate. After a few moments, he smiled. It's just like on Taprisha, but the opposite. Some of my laws are enhanced, while others are weakened. I was right. When he reached out to sense the law of the universe, he found that the laws of wrath, gluttony, and sloth had all become easier to sense. His other laws, however, had become more distant and hard to feel. Once he found that out, he made his decision instantly. I can take turns moving back and forth between Taprisha and Blizzaria as I get all the laws to progress up a stage, and then more. His law of original sin would only make progress if all of his laws were at a similar or greater level of comprehension. He shifted slightly as a layer of ice began to cover his body. He then began pouring all his focus into strengthening his understanding of the laws of the universe. Meanwhile, on a planet far away, Sun Wukong looked out at the setting sun with a small smile on his face. The sunlight reflected in his eyes, glowing with light that didn't seem to truly land on him. My time has finally come. The words he whispered aloud echoed around the large branch he sat on, jutting out of the lower side of the world tree. He sat alone, leaning up against a large clump on the branch. His staff lay across his lap as he sat, resting quietly. Time passed silently as Sun Wukong watched the day die. Soon, night was upon him. Various creatures could be heard, chirping or growling. A bustling ecosystem of life flourished, creatures hunting creatures, animals finding rest. The lonesome light of a single moon fluttered into existence above, dimly lighting the world around him. The night continued its inevitable march forward. Hours flew by. Still, Sun Wukong sat, looking to the west. Gradually, the night began to slip away. The light of the sun once again began its gentle creep over the horizon, back behind Sun Wukong on the opposite side of the tree. A small smile appeared on Sun Wukong's face as he spotted something else, however. A group of figures had appeared in the distance, walking along one of the large roots to the world tree that was directly adjacent to him. "Wise lady, have I made you proud?" Sun Wukong muttered as he gazed out at the distant group that was approaching him. The Free School of Thunder has begun to take action. The free-spirited anomalies have left, with a guardian far more powerful than he understands, while my beast generals stand guard over the others in this source world. He talked to himself. Everything I have done, everything I have achieved in this life. I have made all the preparations I could. He reflected quietly. He was Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, the almighty ruler of the Grawl Alliance. An alliance he helped forge with blood and steel, conquering huge amounts of territory and pouring vast amounts of resources into it. A vast empire that spanned thousands of worlds, controlling trillions of lives. All for a single mission, preparing for a single moment across its 1,000-year history. A single purpose, to stop a single man. A man that had become a god. I always knew you would make it back, my old sparring partner. The divine realm would hold little charm for you. Sun Wukong shook his head, a sad smile appearing. Even if my eyes couldn't see that far. I always suspected. Alas, it truly has come to pass. He sighed. And yet, before we can truly meet, my time has come. Perhaps you and I can meet in the next. Sun Wukong slowly began to stand up. He took a look up at the early morning sky, his eyes growing distant. I have done my best, wise lady. I am but a simple monkey. I have done all I can for these 30,000 worlds. His gaze wavered as his shoulders hunched. For a lone moment, it seemed like he was bearing an enormous burden upon his shoulders. One that had haunted him for 1,000 years, one he bore silently, freely, out of love for life and its inhabitants, and a desire to do what was right. Sun Wukong's hands began to tremble. He clutched at his heart, his chest shivering. A few drops of blood appeared on his lips. His eyes flashed with light, a moment later, as he instantly regained control. He wiped the blood off on his hand and then looked at it, his eyes calm. But before I go, there is one more thing I must do. He looked away from his blood, burning it off his hand in a flash as he began to walk towards the group of figures that were approaching him. In no time at all, he intercepted them. The group was not unfamiliar to him. Greetings, Lord Wukong. Melo's respectful voice echoed in the air as he nodded at Sun Wukong. Behind Melo stood Zafin and Aaron, as well as 3 other unique-looking beings. One looked as if he was made completely out of glowing, translucent crystal rocks, with a face carved from that rough crystal, towering 3 meters high. Another seemed to be half woman, half plant, with green eyes that glowed ominously. The last had dark red skin and looked vaguely like a titan, except one that was much smaller and leaner, with stark blue hair, of all things. Melo's comrades that he had introduced to Sun Wukong before. Number 29, number 40, and number 83. At the time, they hadn't picked names for themselves yet, according to what Melo claimed. I have come here to ask if there is any way we might be able to help you. While we might not all be the strongest, all of us have successfully broken into the king class now and are, before Melo could finish, however, Sun Wukong cut him off. Hello, Melo and company. The Monkey King gave them all a somber smile as he continued. There actually is something you all can help me with. Sun Wukong didn't beat around the bush. Melo's jaw dropped open slightly as the extremely direct and abrupt response. He blinked for a single moment and then wiped away the expression of shock, giving Sun Wukong a strong nod. It has to do with one of your brethren. One you are familiar with. An anomaly that goes by the name Dorian. Sun Wukong began. Melo nodded quietly when he heard the name, giving away nothing. Aaron and Zafin, on the other hand, both seemed to freeze up, turning their full and complete attention over to Sun Wukong. I happen to know that he is soon to be in danger. Grave, mortal danger that cannot be avoided. Sun Wukong paused for a moment. In that pause, the usually silent Aaron jumped forward, the metallic armor that covered him clanking. We must rescue him. We cannot allow our brother to die. Not him. Aaron's words shook the air, full of conviction. Aaron had never forgotten all that Dorian had done for him, back when Dorian had saved him on Magmoor. The other anomalies seemed taken aback, especially the 3 newer ones, as they all turned and stared at him. None of them spoke, however, as Melo held up a hand. I know of him. What danger is he in? Melo asked back quietly, his eyes flaring up. Melo didn't like humans. He didn't like shades. He didn't like Ethmen. He didn't even like monkeys. He did, however, care about and like his fellow brethren. Those that came into this world, just like him. The ones he considered true family. Dorian even more so, given their alliance in the past. What danger, Sun Wukong turned away from the west, his gaze soaring out to the east, beyond the world tree behind him. A being of great power has set off to kill him. If you all come with me, we will make it there in time. If you all do not, then we will be too late. What being? Who is coming for him? Mello cut in, a sense of urgency coloring his tone. Sun Wukong turned to look back at Mello and sighed. A misguided fool. I can sense it. Finally, after all this time. Zero's laughter filled the air as he stood on the highest peak of the restructured planet of Hani. Lightning and wind blasted all around him, the erratic weather of the planet running roughshod over the atmosphere. Time had passed quickly for the second-born. He had focused purely on meditation and thanks to that made great progress. He was now fully restored, healed at a pace that exceeded his hopes. His boosted regeneration seemed to come about because of the current state of the now exotic world of Hani. This world had just undergone a huge change. Everything here was chaotic, with huge tracts of land and space suffering annihilation. That change seemed to have even caused an effect in the laws of the universe itself. Zero had found it easier than ever to draw upon the law of annihilation, especially so in his angelic class state. His recovery speed has been greatly enhanced thanks to that. And now, restored back to his prime, Zero made a discovery. His soul had been purged of his presence. The soul remnant of Ukeli was no longer present. However, by removing that piece, his soul seemed to have gained an inherent draw to all of the other soul remnants, as if looking and seeking to try and become whole again. His soul had grown used to that attachment, and without it, it felt like he was missing something. This inherent draw pulled him in multiple directions, along invisible lines of fate. Because of that, he found that he could sense these remnant souls, able to pinpoint almost exactly where he felt them, and transposing that on a mental map of the 30,000 worlds. But beyond even that, Zero found that he was able to distinguish between all of the remnant souls by a simple factor. He could roughly sort them by age. He could detect how long each fragment had been in the 30,000 worlds for the remnant souls distinguishable by minute amounts. While Ukeli's soul had obviously been in the 30,000 worlds long ago, the traces of age Zero could sense covered only their time from their recent re-arrival. And of all the soul fragments he could sense, only a single one felt older than the age of his own soul. Firstborn, the greatest achievement of him, the being that he put most of his hopes into. Zero clenched his fists. A rippling, blood-red halo appeared around his head. The air around him shivered, bright red light appearing and, just moments later, causing a small explosion. The mountain peak he stood on was obliterated into shards of dust as a huge, gaping hole in reality appeared. This tear in space itself was jagged, with black lines that shivered ominously. However, instead of black nothingness caused by the tear, another world appeared within Zero's vision. By using his law of annihilation and angelic class soul spell matrix, as well as all the abilities of his various forms, Zero had had an epiphany. He had discovered a way to rip through reality, gaining the ability to teleport from world to world, vastly increasing his travel speed. He is far to the east. If I travel as fast as I can, I should be able to reach him in just a couple of days. Zero's words cut through the air, the red light staining the world around him like blood. My brother, the only way he can be killed is if I free all of his remnants and then kill him personally. Zero's chest heaved as he talked out loud to himself, causing the world around him to distort slightly due to the sheer, massive amount of energy he was concentrating. I will put your bloodlines to use against him. And I will kill him. No matter how difficult, no matter how painful, no matter how impossible it may prove to be. I will bear that burden. The words boomed in the air. Zero was silent for a moment, his eyes gleaming as he exhaled slowly. Forgive me, this is the only way you or I will ever truly be free. Zero's voice was somber. It held a hint of anger, but also a hint of guilt and self-hatred. Beyond all of that, however, it carried a tone of absolute determination. He must be stopped. Chapter 223 Everything. The greater world of Beraldo was a massive planet. Most greater worlds were of such size and scale that it was mind-boggling. When compared to the Earth that Dorian was familiar with, the greater world of Beraldo was 20 times larger. Despite its massive size, the gravity on this planet functioned the same as it did on every other planet, almost identical to Earth's. This was a function of the unique laws of the universe, mystical rules that made this reality possible. On this planet, more than 800 billion beings existed. 90% of them were human, with the other percentages split up between Eth, vampire, shade, and other races. It was a diverse world with a thriving populace, largely in part because of its nearness to both the Graal Alliance and the Boral Autarky. Despite being set between rival powers, the land here instead acted as a buffer zone. It was a world that neither side controlled. For, the greater world of Beraldo was overseen by two extremely powerful forces, both ones that dated back with a history more than 1,000 years old. The Golden Kingdom and the Elector Empire. I finally made it here. Will spoke quietly to himself as he looked down at the mug of beer he held in his hand. And yet I am useless. Will raised the mug up to his face and took a long draw from it, feeling the rough liquor slide into his stomach. It had a strong taste, similar to the drinks he'd had back when he still lived with his family. The moment the alcohol entered his system, his body automatically purged it, treating it like a poison. His body was miraculous and powerful, possessing unique abilities that were inborn and innate. As a result of that, he could never get drunk. He sighed. Around Will, a grungy, dismal-looking common room spread out. The mid-afternoon light shined brightly outside, mostly blocked by the shuttered windows. The common room was made of wood, with 24 brown wooden tables and chairs, a couple of long tables, and a large fireplace that currently had nothing in it. The floor was covered in dirt, over a layer of rough wood. A doorway off to the left opened up into the main lobby of the inn, while a doorway off to his right was one of several entrances to a closed-off stable. Only about a fifth of the tables around Will were occupied, with several other humans nursing drinks, wasting away as the day slipped past. Why is it that every time I grow stronger, all of my enemies all of a sudden seem to be one step above me? Will took another swig of the useless alcohol, sighing again. I suppose it's just that any enemies on my level have already been defeated, leaving me to deal with threats that I can't already deal with. He nodded as he reached the conclusion. He had worked so hard to make it this far. He'd traveled across numerous worlds, bringing along several comrades and allies. And, after all of that, he realized the enormity of his mission and his own mistake. The man he was looking for, to pass on the Elder Mage's last words, the Holy Duke Archel of the Elector Empire. The powerful, pseudo-angelic class expert wasn't even here. From the rumors he'd managed to find, the powerful warrior had gone out to train in seclusion and hadn't been heard from in years, though it was a fact that he was still alive. Even worse, the enemy that was behind the Elder Mage's death, going by the memories he had been given, was the great pariah of the Golden Kingdom, Bruiner Gamel. A pseudo-angelic class expert. And not only was he a pseudo-angelic class expert, but he was one that was ranked on the recording of might, indicating he was an extremely powerful expert among experts. I can't find the one person I need to meet, and my enemy is much stronger than me, with a literal army of experts at his beck and call. Will's face scrunched up as he sighed, feeling exhausted. He looked at the empty seats at his table with another sigh. All of the anomalies that had accompanied him had decided to go off on a touring adventure of the city they were in, a decent-sized place that held around 1 million people. It was a unique-looking city called Bapbo, built into the middle of a thriving forest, with a huge stream running through part of it. That left him alone, drowning in his misery as he tried to figure out a way to find the Holy Duke, or defeat the Great Pariah. Maybe one of the Holy Duke's descendants would be able to pass along a message? He mused quietly to himself, lost in thought. Several minutes passed as Will sat, thinking about his future. He had put all of his energy into everything that led up to this moment. After coming back to life, this had become something he lived as a mission. He would repay what he owed the elderly wizard that had helped change his life forever. Faintly, Will heard someone open the door to the common room and slip inside. He ignored that at first, focused on inner reflection. His thoughts were scattered, however, as a woman appeared and sat down at his table, right in front of him. He blinked and looked up at the woman, his mouth falling open at her abrupt entrance. Can I help you?" He stared at her in confusion. The woman was gorgeous. She wore a semi-translucent gown, with her long brown hair wrapped up in a braid. Her face was dotted with small, jade-colored scales and she had an ethereal quality about her, something that felt otherworldly. The moment he realized this, Will instantly went on guard. The woman looked incredibly out of place in this dingy inn's common room. She studied Will for a moment, her lips pursing. The two simply looked at each other for a few seconds in silence. Finally, she spoke aloud. "I need your help." Her voice was cool and refreshing, but carried with it a hint of urgency. "You need my help?" Will stuttered back, his eyes narrowing. "Yes. Your name is Will, right?" The woman gave him a small nod. "Yes," Will muttered slowly. As he spoke, he leaned back slightly, his hand going to his spatial ring, just in case. "Please help me. I must find Lady Osra's successor. He is our last hope." The woman stood up from where she'd sat and then knelt down on the floor of the inn, bowing her head. She leaned over so low her face was mere inches above the ground. Whoa, hold on now. Lady, I don't even know who you are." Will took a few steps forward, bending over and helping the woman to her feet. Her dress didn't grow stained from the dirt that cluttered the wooden floor, magically preventing it from sticking. "Who are you?" he continued, staying on alert the entire time. "My name is Mira. I am a member of the Wise Jade tribe. And I need to contact a friend of yours." She slowly began to explain herself, her eyes welling up as she spoke, as if she was struggling with something. Who do you need to talk to?" Will replied slowly. "Lady Osra's successor." "Ah, his given name is Dorian," Mira quickly replied, nodding her head. When he heard that, he frowned internally. Dorian? What does she want with him? That anomaly was a being he considered a friend for life. He would never rat him out, not in a million years. "How do you even know I know this Dorian? How did you even find me?" Will was full of questions as he stared at Mira, processing everything she had told him. "The Wise Jade tribe? Wait, isn't that a tribe of dragons?" Just as he realized that, another voice broke into the conversation. The speaker came seemingly out of nowhere, the man's words echoing in the air just a few meters behind Mira as he walked forward. Will blinked when he saw this, wondering if his eyes had betrayed him, something that was quite unusual for his powerful body. "That would be because of me, young Will." The new speaker was a black-skinned human wearing a set of loose, open vest and pants that were stained gray. He had shoulder-length dreadlocks and a variety of facial paint on, giving him a rather odd appearance. His force of presence seemed to be incredibly lacking, Will noticed. It was almost like he wasn't here at all. Despite that, he could feel a subtle sense of danger coming off this figure. The man in front of him was a powerful expert. "And you are?" Will crossed his arms as he slowly sat back down. He didn't waver or fumble, but kept a cool head, something that came from his newfound confidence in himself. The power he had gained, under son Wukong's tutelage, his own growth, and the inheritance he'd gained, all helped contribute to that. "I am known to some as the Nameless Monk, a member of the Free School of Thunder. You and I haven't ever properly met." The monk held out a hand, sitting down at the table across from Will. Mira sat down again, this time next to the monk. Will gingerly took his hand and shook it. The monk had a strong handshake. When he heard that the monk was from the Free School of Thunder, his heart began to pound. The Free School of Thunder was one of the most mysterious and powerful organizations in all of the 30,000 worlds. They were famed for the virtuous laws many of them studied, or had records of, as well their charitable work. They had a considerable amount of influence, but never seemed to use that influence except to enact minor changes. "I was there the day you came back to life, on Magmoor." The monk dropped this bombshell remark as he let go of Will's shocked hand, smiling slightly. "We at the Free School of Thunder have a simple mantra. Lightning strikes at the beck and call of nature. One must live freely and unfettered if one wishes to survive in this world. We do not seek to control reality, but rather, guide it in times of need." His voice was deep and contained only a hint of emotion, buried far within his words. I don't understand. What are you trying to say? What does your group want with me or Dorian?" Will stared at the monk, his voice containing a faint hint of irritation as he pushed past his shock at the monk's knowledge of his resurrection. The tyranny of virtue is as unbearable as the stranglehold of vice. Alas, our passivity seems to have led us into a quandary. "And that is what draws me here to you." The nameless monk sighed. Will didn't bother trying to decipher the man's cryptic words. Instead, he simply waved for him to continue. You see, young Will. Everything ties back to you. You were at the start of all of this, and you will be at the end of all of this as well. It is your destiny, should you choose to accept it. You are the key to the survival of this reality. The monk waved back at him. And that is why I am here. The monk finished. I'm the key to the survival of this reality? What? Will stuttered out a response, taken aback. Everything the man said had come off so abrupt, they're meeting something that happened out of nowhere. Do you think everything in your life has been for nothing? The magical inheritance you obtained, your return to life by your friend Dorian, your presence here, greeting me. The nameless monk began. All of this has happened for a reason. Everything in life has purpose. You may choose to step away from that purpose if you wish. That is your right, as a free being. The nameless monk paused for a moment, as if to catch his breath. Will jumped into that moment to reply. Look, I can tell that you are strong and likely pretty important, somewhere. But I'm not here to do whatever it is you want me to do. I am here to fulfill my mission, and I'm not going to give you any info about my friend. Will laid it all out. The nameless monk seemed slightly taken aback as Will continued. You are part of the Free School of Thunder, right? If your group is so powerful, why don't you all solve whatever problem you have yourselves? Who are you to demand I do anything at all? Will's voice shook the air as particles of light fluctuated around him, a pure, blinding aura of light forming around him. He wasn't going to do anyone's bidding, even if they asked nicely. There were a few moments of tense silence as both sides stared at each other. The other people in the common room had long since frozen. The powerful auras Will and Mira alone had given off enough to send many unconscious. Let me explain by telling you this. First, are you aware of who the head monk of the Free School of Thunder is? The nameless monk took up a different approach. Yes, it's Homa Whistleberry, the Thunder Prophet. Will replied slowly. Yes, and the head monk sent me here to find you, and her. He sent me here bearing a prophecy, one that concerns your purpose in this reality, should you accept it. The monk returned, equally slowly. Will slowed down, his expression dimming as he heard this. If what the man said was true, his current physique and understanding of it, as well as his magic, gave him the ability to tell whether someone was lying to him, up to some degree. And, right now, he could tell that the monk in front of him was telling the truth. What did the head monk's prophecy read? Will queried, a frown on his face. He gradually began to treat the two in front of him like guests instead of possible enemies. He could feel that they lacked any bad intentions. If there really was a prophecy made about him, it would be wise to at least hear this duo out. The head monk of the Free School of Thunder was an eccentric, rarely heard from figure, but he was also a true blue angelic class expert. He was famed for the magical prophecies he left, ones that often, but not always, came true. Will had learned all of this from both son Wukong and from his own personal research and exploration into the mighty powers of the 30,000 worlds. His prophecy for you is short, only 2 sentences. The monk's voice took on a mystical echo as he gazed at Will. Will gazed back, taking a deep breath as he felt tension rise in his heart. Listen well, young Will, for the weight of reality shall rest upon your shoulders. To save it, you must lose everything, but give up nothing. Will's mouth fell open as he heard the monk's words. What? The lesser world of Torif was a very normal planet. It had no special features and was a rather boring place. The size of its oceans were average, and the number of mountains or other unique natural creations were minimal. The planet was dominated mostly by large, sloping plains and hills. In terms of populace, this particular world had only around 10 million people living on it, quite small for any planet. The inhabitants of Torif were nomadic in nature and, as one of the worlds of lesser importance to the Boreal autarchy, this planet was allowed to maintain its unique culture. Not only did the autarchy allow it, they even supported it, providing funding and guards to keep the planet in its natural state. Right now, however, the nomads of Torif had fled away to the farthest corners of the planet, moving away from one specific area. A place where one world bridge connected. A world bridge that led to the lesser world of Nugdal. A planet controlled by the Boreal autarchy, one that was right next to a world that bordered the draconic tribes, Angdo. Both Angdo and Nugdal had fallen. The resistance offered in either world had been minimal. After all, what can anyone really do against an army of dragons? For regular beings, resistance was a sheer impossibility. Even the Boral autarky hadn't seemed interested in combat, pulling back all of their troops before the draconic tribes even invaded. The sun gleamed overhead as the daylight on Torif as a single man appeared on the world bridge from Nugdal, heading towards Torif. The man wore a simple set of black pants and no shirt. He was muscular, with a handsome face and piercing blue eyes, his blue eyes flashing with energy that complemented his strong chin. He wielded no weapon and didn't seem to have any artifacts on him, beyond a spatial ring. Abruptly, this man smiled. His body blurred. An instant later, it reappeared, a full 15 miles away from the world bridge, in the lowest part of a large, sloping hill. He was in a sort of valley-like depression between a set of hills. He stood in this valley, looking up at the horizon, the smile still present on his face. In the background, what sounded like rumbling thunder began to echo. This rumble grew louder and louder until it reached a crescendo, shaking the air itself. Throughout all of this, the lone man waited patiently. Finally, as the rumble hit that peak, people began to emerge over the top of the hilly slope to the west. First it was just a handful of armored warriors. Then a dozen. Then 100. Then thousands. Then tens of thousands. A virtual sea of muscle and metal appeared, powerful currents of energy rippling in the air as a massive army of warriors formed up into position on the large, hilly slope, all facing towards the lone man at the center. Hundreds of wizards began to float up into the air, using magical artifacts in coordination to stand above the warriors, prepared to provide support. The crackles of fire, the twirls of wind, large chunks of rock, frozen spears of water, a myriad of energy and magical creations slowly began to form. At the very front of this army, a woman walked about a dozen meters out. She had long, lustrous black hair and eyes. She wore a full set of tight, rust-colored armor that was covered in ornately carved skulls. She gazed out at the lone man, an orange gleam of energy appearing in her eyes. A moment later, a blistering, orange halo appeared around her head, proclaiming her presence for all the world to see. She was Cynthia Goudet, the Deathwall, head of the Boral Autarky's Annihilation Department, ranked 7th on the recording of might, in the Angelic Class section. An Angelic Class expert. Behind her stood two other figures. One was a small man that stood well below the average height of a man. He was balding, with graying hair and a lined face. He wore a set of black robes and held a long, black staff in his hands. He was Heptarel Ente, the World Wall, head of the Boral Autarky's Gravity Department, ranked 9th on the recording of might, in the Pseudo-Angelic Class section. The other figure was a middle-aged man wearing a tight, bright pink robe, with a large gourd strapped to his back. The air around this man was pure and almost crystalline, carrying with it a calm, but powerful, aura. He was Jiro Cork, the Diamond Wall, head of the Boral Autarky's Diamond Department, and an extremely powerful wizard that, while not at the pseudo-angelic class, was renowned for his great might. All three of these figures were some of the true elites of reality, some of the most powerful beings in existence. They all watched silently, in front of an army composed of tens of thousands of powerful lord and king experts. The second main division of the Boral Autarky, a force built up over years and years of recruitment and effort, one of the oldest branches of the Autarky military. All of this prepared for a single man, and whatever he may bring. All of this prepared for the lone man that stood before them. To stop me from saving reality, they could only muster this much, huh? Ukeli muttered, frowning slightly as he gazed out upon the sea of enemies. Has the 30,000 worlds forgotten who I am? He shook his head, and then, slowly, he began to walk forward. Steady, hold, wait, hold the lines, stand at the ready. A burst of yell boomed in the air as hundreds of captains and commanders ordered their men and women to prepare for battle. The sounds of tens of thousands of warriors shifting, of wizards clapping their hands together and preparing to cast new spells. The air became even more electric, energy vibrating as the world itself seemed to distort due to the huge concentration of power. Back at the front of the towering, elite force of humanity. All right, Cynthia, what do we do? Jiro's voice was soft, but his words carried a huge amount of energy and weight as he stared at the slowly approaching man. He reached onto his back and took a long gulp of alcohol from his gourd, his body taking on a shiny gleam. Cynthia glanced back at him dispassionately. We do as His Majesty said. Her voice was cold. We stop him. Chapter 224 found. Laws were a funny thing. To Dorian, who saw himself as a native of Earth, it had been almost inconceivable that he could focus on or think about something, and by doing so, open up his senses to an entire law that governed reality. Logically, something like that made no sense. At least, not on Earth. Yet here, in the mysterious 30,000 worlds, the impossible happened on a daily basis. Sitting atop the shoulder and outstretched arm of an enormous giant was a large clump of ice. This ice gleamed with light, as if something mysterious was taking place within it. Around this clump of ice, the world was still and cool. The huge waterfall of ice nearby moved in a strict area, never flowing outward unless something else interfered with it. Down below, Greycons could occasionally be seen patrolling the outer area, but none of them would ever come close to the towering, frozen giant. Abruptly, this clump of ice began to crack. Bits and pieces of it trembled as a network of cracks spread out, shattering into nothingness. The air around the ice suddenly was cast a flurry as a wave of energy blasted forward. Boom! The clump of ice fully disintegrated, revealing a demonic figure. Dorian, in his balanced demon form. Law's progress. He spoke the words out loud, his voice hoarse as he blinked. He rubbed at his shoulders and arms, flicking off chunks of ice. Law's progress. Virtuous laws, 4/7. Demonic laws, 7/7. Law of original sin 25%. He smiled. I'm more than halfway to the middle stage. He muttered out loud. Hitting an understanding of roughly 40% was a big deal, though most people weren't able to track it so numerically. His control of the law of original sin was split into 10 minor stages, a thing that was unique from most other laws, something he could intrinsically sense. Every 10% he achieved, his grasp of the origin law grew stronger. My understanding of it has grown enough, it's time. As he sensed the increased power he held, he came to a decision. Deep within the farthest recesses of Dorian's soul, there existed something that was not part of him. Something that had been with him ever since his birth in this world. Something he had never managed to successfully remove. Ukele's soul fragment. Ukele had gone dormant long ago, after he determined it was impossible to sway Dorian or seize control of his soul. Dorian had had multiple mental confrontations with the man, all of which ended in a draw or him coming out ahead, eventually. However, just because Ukele was no longer active didn't mean he was gone. To the best of Dorian's knowledge, it was impossible for him to get rid of Ukele's soul fragment unless he purged his own soul, ripping it to shreds and killing himself. The fragment had melded with him. The law of original sin allows me to corrupt reality. It is an origin law, a law of power that reigns over a multitude of others. He continued to speak out loud. I may not ever be able to remove Ukele's dormant soul fragment. But what if I tear down the walls that protect it, overriding its defenses? This was a thought that had struck him long ago, the moment he learned of the law of original sin. It was a law that reshaped reality itself, creating weaknesses, corrupting things. What if, instead of being absorbed by Ukele like he wants? Dorian smiled, his eyes glowing in the cool air of the underground cavern. I absorb him. Dorian closed his eyes. Immediately, he focused not only on his soul, but also on the law of original sin. He felt raw energy flow into his body. This energy felt volatile and dangerous, seductive in its overwhelming strength. Power that left him feeling almost drunk, giddy on the feeling of control. Power to change the world around him with his will alone. He grasped a hold of that energy, seizing upon it. As he did so, a stray dot fluttered across his vision. This dot was joined by a second dot. The dots only appeared for a moment before they vanished. With an understanding of 25%, the energy Dorian could muster was incredible. The air around his visibly warped, taking on a dark, evil tone. After a few seconds, Dorian seized control fully. The huge increase in power had left him temporarily stunned at first, but his powerful soul and willpower allowed him to regain his focus. I'll need to be more careful in the future. Each big increase is likely to prove shocking to my soul. He took mental note of this. Dorian then sat down on the frozen giant's shoulder. He closed his eyes and began to meditate, focusing on himself. Gradually, Dorian was able to call to mind an image in his head. In a world covered in white fog, Dorian saw a huge, massive white orb. Sparks of energy and electricity could be seen flowering in and around this orb, shooting out and then falling back in. Dorian appeared next to this orb, looking up at it. It towered over him, standing easily 10 times his height. He froze when he saw this. This is my soul? He was viewing his own soul from the outside. His soul was so powerful now he could do many things he couldn't have done before. He could actually examine his soul in its full form, peering into every detail. It's so big, his first thought was to its sheer size. It was incredibly large and gave off a majestic, mighty feeling. His eyes narrowed slightly as he saw something off to the left, while scanning the massive orb. There was a smaller orb, one that was so tiny in comparison to the main orb that he had missed it at first. It was colored a dim, gray color, not matching the pure white of his soul. This orb fluttered right next to the big orb, solidly connected to it. Fully half of its surface seemed to be embedded and merged with Dorian's soul. Euclid's fragment, Dorian muttered, frowning. Now that he consciously studied it, he could tell that this wasn't going to be easy. It's merged with me already. Not fully, but part of it is definitely merged with my soul. He couldn't just try and directly destroy it. Doing so would irreparably damage his own soul, and that was assuming he could even destroy Euclid's fragment. The fragment was set up in a way that it would steal energy from Dorian's main soul, allowing it to continue its existence. It was a parasite, connected to him irreparably. It only required a very small amount of energy, but it was able to take that amount freely, thanks to its condition. Well, my plan is still the same. He shrugged. He was only going to try and absorb it. The fact that it had partially merged with him would make that easier. Dorian vanished and then reappeared, floating right next to Euclid's soul fragment. It was about his size, in this odd, mental soul world he was in. He wasn't actually here in person, but rather, personified by the will of his soul, looking inward. Slowly, Dorian reached out and laid a hand on the smaller orb. Nothing happened. He grinned ruefully. He didn't have a sense of touch here, he couldn't actually feel anything strange about it. Still, from inside his soul, he could sense the aberration that was Euclid. Very well. After a few moments, he began to gather his concentration. The thronging energy within him was begging to be used, causing his heart to pulse. His eyes flashed as he looked at the spot where the smaller orb joined up with the bigger orb. Absorb. He issued the mental command with all the authority he could muster. Immediately, the rippling energy he held within his soul blasted outward and slammed into the small orb. Dorian's vision distorted as reality began to twist, the air around him creaking. Sweat formed on his forehead as he panted in the real world, his heart pounding. Dorian's soul trembled. Abruptly, parts of his soul began to twist. Excruciating pain flooded through Dorian's mind as the very essence of his being felt as if it was being ripped apart. Dorian forced his way past the agony as he stared at what was happening in his soul. His own soul was visibly twisting, the orb's previously smooth lines vanishing. This had caused Euclid's orb to twist as well. As soon as this twisting began, Dorian's soul had rushed forward, seeking to envelop and swallow Euclid's orb. If he could sweep around and take in Euclid's remnants, he would be able to force it to fully merge with him. However, as Dorian drew upon the origin law of original sin, causing Euclid's defenses to weaken at the cost of living through agonizing pain, he found that Euclid was still, somehow, managing to resist him. Dorian's soul slammed against Euclid's remnants and was rebuffed, again and again. The reality-twisting powers of the law of original sin were effective at weakening Euclid's soul, but even with all of that throw against him, the man was still resisting his efforts. Incredible, his soul remnant is able to resist even when reality itself is turned against it. Dorian shook his head as he relaxed his soul. Euclid was truly a monster if even his soul fragment was this powerful. However, a small smile appeared on Dorian's face. When Euclid's soul remnant was in the midst of being hit with his law of original sin, Dorian was able to sense several changes. Previously, the soul remnant had been like a magical wall, impenetrable despite Dorian's best efforts. Now, however, whenever the law of original sin touched it, that wall began to weaken. It wasn't currently enough, even if he went all out, for him to absorb the soul remnant. But even the strongest being in the world couldn't perfectly resist the changes of reality. My mastery is not even at the middle stage yet, let alone the late stage or completion. A feeling of exultation filled Dorian as he realized this. You may resist me now, leeching onto my soul like poison, but what about then? The thought fluttered in his mind. Ukeli did not respond. The remnant remained dormant, refusing to do anything other than defend itself. Dorian closed his eyes again as he once more entered meditation, his motivation to free himself of Ukeli's touch stronger than ever. On the exotic world of Manuka, a peaceful desert known as the Sulabi Desert existed. This desert wasn't very large, but there was something unique about it. In this particular desert, a large world bridge shuttled into the ground, connecting it to a planet far away. This world bridge normally teemed with life, one of the rare oases in the Sulabi Desert. Right now, however, not even a single being dared to make a peep. For there stood a man on this bridge, a man that exuded an aura of dominance and might. An aura that spoke to the truths of annihilation itself. I can sense several of my brethren moving towards the firstborn's location. Zero frowned as he rubbed his chin, looking up at the sky. His eyes were unfocused, as if he was looking past the sky to things only he could sense. And, indeed, that was the case. Right now, he was currently tracking the locations of his brethren. In particular, he was focused on a clump of anomalies that were headed in the direction of the firstborn. Zero took a few seconds to think, trying to understand their motive. From Zero's perspective, it could only be one of two things. Either his fellow anomalies were, like him, hunting the firstborn, or they were allies and subordinates of the firstborn returning to his aid. Given how powerful the firstborn must be, Zero felt it likely to be the second option. He paused for a few more seconds in thought. Though his brethren were moving quickly, they still weren't moving anywhere near fast enough to exceed his speed. His law of annihilation and angelic class soul spell matrix allowed him to rip holes in reality itself, moving at an extremely quick speed. If he wanted to, he could arrive at the firstborn's location more than a dozen hours before the others, going by their current speed. I'll need to collect their bloodlines anyway. After he finished thinking it over, he nodded slightly. He began to step forward again, raising a hand as he prepared to rip through reality. This time, as he traveled, he modulated his pace. He didn't rush forward as fast as possible, but instead moved with purpose, slowing his pace so that he'd reach the firstborn just a half hour before the other anomalies, allowing him to swoop them all up one after the other. And like that, in what seemed like no time at all, Zero ripped through one final hole in reality, jumping forward and landing on the ground. The powerful warrior blinked as he took in his surroundings. Flurries of snow and wind, crackling lightning and thunder, a literal blizzard rushing in the air. "Ah, I made it to Blizzeria." Zero smiled, his deep voice echoing softly in the air around him. The thronging weather was unable to touch him, an invisible force field blocking it off as he gathered his bearings. Zero looked to the left and to the right, before his head slowly began to turn and look down. Firstborn, Zero's eyes flashed. "I have found you." Chapter 225 faded. "Ah, I managed to reach 26%. At this rate, he would be able to reach 40% comprehension in no time at all." Dorian grinned beneath the ice that had reappeared around him, feeling the energy flow in his veins. He had reached the middle stage for all of his other demonic laws on Taprisha, he just needed to reach the middle stage for the remaining ones here. After that, he decided he would ferry himself back and forth, stopping for nothing until he reached completion. He had too little time to waste. "All right. Back to..." Dorian stopped mid-thought as he sensed something completely unexpected. A faint awareness appeared, coming from a few miles out. One that resonated with his soul. The feeling he got when he sensed a fellow anomaly. Wait, it feels different? He couldn't quite place why, but this time, it felt odd. The sensation was there, but it no longer felt quite like the other anomalies he had sensed. Something about it was subtly different. He couldn't explain exactly what with words. Boom! The ice that was shrouding Dorian exploded as he stood up, going on high alert. A shower of fine snow particles cascaded in the air as he expanded his senses, turning to look in the direction of his fellow anomaly. He was taking no chances. At the same time, a black, near-invisible flicker of energy covered his body. The black luster ability he'd gained from his new vampire form was the strongest defensive ability he controlled. He also activated his perfect body ability, raising the raw power and senses of his physique to a new level. As he pulled on his various powers, he leapt off of the frozen giant, landing on the ground nearby. By the time he finished activating his abilities and landed, The other anomaly he sensed had already arrived, moving at an incredibly fast speed. "Hello, Firstborn." A man's voice rumbled out as a figure appeared. The man had long, golden hair and a majestic bearing, with a handsome, muscular face that practically oozed masculinity. "Who are you?" Dorian replied without missing a beat, mentally commanding Asra to scan him. To his shock, Asra came back with almost nothing. Species: Divine Golden Lion, humanoid form. Class: Maximum energy level. I can't scan him at all? As Dorian saw this, his heart seemed to plunge. The last time he remembered seeing this was when he tried to scan an angelic class being. "I am Zero, the Secondborn." Zero's voice boomed out loud as he responded to Dorian's question. A rippling aura burst free from the man as he spoke, blasting away the cold and melting any nearby ice. Dorian simply stared back, his body tingling as he prepared for anything. His eyes zeroed in on Zero, giving away nothing. Zero looked back and shook his head. "This moment, for all my existence, I thought about what I would say, how this would happen. Yet, now that I stand before you." Zero held up a hand and then slowly lowered it with a sigh. "I am sorely disappointed. You stand before me as the first of our kind, yet you lack the capacity to bear the burden we face." Genuine disappointment filled Zero's tone. Dorian was in the middle of replying when Zero attacked, giving him absolutely no warning. 1 second, Zero was standing several dozen meters away. The next second, he had already appeared in front of Dorian. Boom! A small explosion shook the air as Zero punched forward, violent red energy covering his fist as he drew upon his law of annihilation. The powerful warrior's body shivered as fluctuations of energy ran through it, his sheer physical power condensed into such a small being. A flurry of ice and dust were thrown into the air, creating a cloud of debris as Dorian's body was flung backward, instantly obscured. A loud rending sound sounded off in the air, stone cracking and shivering. Zero watched all of this dispassionately, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the cloud of dust. After a few seconds, that cloud of dust cleared up and away. And when it did, it revealed a demonic figure standing still. 2 long lines were gouged out into the stone for several meters, ripped apart by Dorian's feet when he forced his body to absorb the impact and not get sent flying. That was a bit rude. Dorian casually raised his hand to his shoulder, flicking off a few random pieces of ice. In the split second Zero had used to attack, Dorian fully realized how powerful the foe that had found him was. He absolutely could not afford to underestimate the warrior. He instantly called upon his law of lust, enhancing his perception of time and allowing him to do several things in an instant. Then, as he was attacked, he simultaneously activated the new void control ability he'd gained from his king-class evolution and his law of envy. Both things focused on control of space, something he immediately manipulated to create a dense wall between him and Zero's fist and weaken Zero's attack. He then activated his law of pride and law of gluttony, one to toughen his body, and the other to add another layer of defensive energy around him. This, combined with his black luster ability and perfect body, allowed him to not only tank the hit but absorb and displace a good portion of Zero's surprise attack. However, as he stood there, Dorian could feel small streams of energy rampaging inside his body. These streams annihilated everything they touched, trying to rip him apart from the inside, an insidious and subtle attack. His eyes flashed as he called upon the law of original sin. He used that to weaken the streams of annihilation energy and then eradicate them. Just like that, Dorian successfully blocked an attack from an angelic class warrior. "Don't you want to at least talk first, Zero?" Dorian frowned. Even if the anomaly truly was angelic class, that didn't mean Dorian would just give up. He had access to such a variety of laws, abilities, and forms, as well as his own extremely powerful soul, that it wasn't necessarily given that he would lose. He had heard of this anomaly. This was the one that, long ago, had declared that he was going to hunt Dorian down. It seemed the creature had held true to its word, searching for and somehow finding Dorian here. If possible, Dorian would prefer to reason with him, like he had with Mello or the 11th born. From Zero's perspective, all he saw was Dorian casually brush off some ice and then form an incredibly evil and demonic aura, one that spoke to the core of sinful nature itself. This combined with Dorian's balanced demon form to make him appear as a horrifying monstrosity. Of course, It was my mistake. Zero shivered as he saw this, his heart starting to pound. His initial disappointment partially vanished as he saw Dorian's seemingly effortless block of his attack. The firstborn is the firstborn, after all. There's no reason for me to hold back. A giant, overpowering aura burst free from the secondborn as he looked at Dorian. A majestic, red halo appeared around Zero's head, gushing with energy. The very air around Zero seemed to shiver, sparking as the anomaly's energy condensed to an extreme level. This powerful aura drew the attention of every single creature within several tens of thousands of meters. The initial clash between Dorian and Zero had woken the frozen city up, turning hundreds of Graycon heads, but this release drew thousands of the armored Minotaur's eyes. Oh man, Dorian cursed in his heart. This wasn't going to be easy. Annihilate. Zero pointed at Dorian and spoke a single word. A wave of red fire blasted forward, simmering through the air as they rocketed towards Dorian. The very fabric of the law of annihilation was imbued into these flames, causing them to destroy everything that blocked their path. Even the stone floor Dorian and Zero were standing on was instantly melted through, the red flames eating away at everything. Black flames. Dorian responded by taking a deep breath and throwing out a huge wave of black fire, crackling flames of his own that collided with Zero's flames of annihilation. Dragonfire was inherently destructive, containing mystic properties that allowed it to melt through things with incredible ease. Conversely, Zero's flames of annihilation held the condensed might of the law of annihilation within them. The resulting clash created a maelstrom of fire that exploded multiple times, turning the center of the city into a chaotic sea of burning fire. Dorian's flames were less potent than Zero's, but Dorian's extremely fine grasp of fire manipulation, gained through his long experience using them, won out over Zero's relative inexperience. As a result, neither party took any serious injuries from the raging fire. A dozen Graycons that had charged in to investigate were instantly vaporized. The frozen waterfall of Gwaran ice created a massive cloud of steam that swooped over the battlefield, but otherwise ignored both types of fire, neither one able to successfully melt through the world phenomena. Huff! Dorian's breath wheezed out of him as he jumped up high into the air. At the same time, he transformed into his new, Empyrean vampire form. His balanced demon form was his best choice for studying various laws, but his Empyrean vampire form had a stronger physique and could better use the void control ability. He blinked. When his eyes opened, Zero reappeared in front of him once more. A small trail of multicolored flames twisted in the air around him, moving seemingly in slow motion due to Dorian's enhanced perception of time. This mother F, the thought was cut off as Zero lashed out again with an extremely powerful punch, this time going all out. The air itself seemed to literally die as he punched forward, annihilating anything in his path. Red streams of energy shot out from his body, crackling backwards in the air. Boom! Dorian smashed downward as if he had been hit by a meteor. Before the blow hit, he threw up every law he could hold onto, tossing out multiple abilities again once more as he sought to weaken Zero's attack. He used his soul to twist fate, and, at the very peak of the warrior's blow, he activated the law of original sin, forcing a weakness to appear as reality itself bent to his will. As a result, the blow only shattered his left arm instead of killing him. Hua! Dorian landed on the ground with his feet planted, causing a 50-meter-wide stone crater to form. Huge chunks of rock shot out into the air, the explosion cascading dirt all about. Dorian's body, once more, stamped out the remnant annihilation energy, using the law of original sin to crush them. A few stray black dots floated across his vision as he drew upon the origin law, straining himself. He ignored the pain from his injured arm, feeling his regenerative powers start to kick in. As expected of the firstborn, Zero saw all of this, his eyes shining more and more as he nodded. His disappointment had now completely vanished, a smile appearing on his face. Dorian glared upwards, his eyes practically spitting fury as he focused. Void control. He locked the space around Zero, causing the anomaly to freeze in midair. Zero almost immediately shattered these envy-boosted restraints, but not before he was frozen for a split second. And in that split second, Dorian charged and activated a certain ability dozens of times. Hyperion Beam, Hyperion Beam, Hyperion Beam. Roughly 100 black orbs formed in the air, surrounding Dorian. Each one was charged with not only raw energy, but also his black flames, granting each one the destructive power of dragonfire. After breaking into the king class, all of his abilities had jumped in strength. In particular, his Hyperion beams and black flames had seen a significant increase in potency. The Hyperion beams that had struggled to injure the one-armed king-class giant he'd faced could now easily obliterate it. Fire. 100 lasers shot through the air. A mixed, red and gold aura of energy formed around Zero, covering him in a layer of light right before the attack landed. Boom! The nearby storm of flames scattered as an explosion of energy sent them flying. Before that explosion could fully spread, however, Dorian struck again. Hyperion beam, Hyperion beam, Hyperion beam, boom, and again, Hyperion beam, Hyperion beam, Hyperion beam, BOOM, and again, Hyperion beam, Hyperion beam, Hyperion beam, BOOM. Fully 4 consecutive explosions from multiple hundreds of Hyperion beams shook the air, temporarily blinding Dorian. The explosions were mostly concentrated upward, spreading out in an expansive fashion alongside a multitude of shockwaves. The resulting ball of fire slammed all the way into the roof thousands of meters overhead, turning the gloomy darkness of the underground cavern alight for a few scant seconds. Dorian's breathing was ragged as he watched all of this, his every sense attuned forward. Such a powerful attack was not something that could just be brushed away, not at his current state. For, hidden in between all those blistering Hyperion beams was an insidious strand of black energy. A blip of energy from the law of original sin. Dorian had snuck this beam into the third attack, using the first 2 in an attempt to trick Zero into a sense of complacency. The reality-shifting energy would have weakened Zero's defenses enough for his fourth and final attack to blast through most barriers blocking it. Dorian felt his soul twinge as the explosions from his attacks settled, leaving behind a large cloud of dust and ash. A deep-seated ache that came from drawing upon too much energy had settled in, letting him know he was reaching his limit. He had been in the midst of meditation and wasn't in an optimal state to fight in the first place. He then drew upon gargantuan amounts of law energy to block and weaken multiple attacks while launching a large number of his own. Unfortunately for Dorian, his hopes of an easy victory were shortly dashed. Firstborn, you have truly surpassed my expectations. Zero's voice was haggard but full of happiness as his figure emerged from the cloud of dust, shooting downward towards the ground. Boom! Another small crater formed as he landed, sending shards of stone shooting out into the air. Zero's figure was a mess. Blood dripped from his lips and several serious and visible burns could be seen on his arms and chest. His injuries weren't healing, something that only seemed to please the anomaly for some odd reason. To injure me like this, an injury that prevents me from regenerating, that is something indeed. Dorian's law of original sin had many unique quirks. One of those had to do with its corrupting power. When the streams of energy invaded Zero's body, forcing its way past the barrier the anomaly formed, it corrupted every wound left on Zero. It was an insidious energy that was extremely hard to expel. However, after it landed, the energy moved beyond Dorian's control, turning largely dormant. The energy remained present, weakening Zero's physique and preventing him from healing, but was unable to inflict any more serious injuries, unlike Zero's annihilation energy. It would take Zero some time to expel the injury, time he couldn't exactly afford in the middle of a battle. Zero smiled grimly at Dorian. He didn't move to attack or defend, standing still as if he was waiting for something. Dorian took advantage of that brief moment of reprieve, resting his aching soul. Around them, the waves of energy and chaotic storm of flames began to settle down and fizzle out. The huge cloud of steam formed from the Gwaran ice waterfall dissipated into minute particles of ice, tinkling to the ground. Thousands of undead Greycons had fully focused on the center of the city and were all rushing here in a flurry. Most of them remained in their non-expanded state, but were preparing to transform as they sensed the multiple explosions taking place. What do you want, Zero? Seeing as the man had stopped attacking him, Dorian took that time to communicate, hoping to stall the anomaly out for a few moments. The more time he had to recover, the better. In general, to be free. Zero shrugged as he continued to stare at Dorian, unmoving. But as of right now, Zero raised up a hand, a smile appearing on his face. Abruptly, he clenched his fist. At the same time, Dorian felt the world around him seem to seize up. Strange, mysterious symbols appeared in the air around him, locking down and slamming into him instantly. He had no time to react to the near-instantaneous appearance, shocking him to the core. I was waiting for my myriad restriction ability to activate. I picked that one up from one of the forms I gained in the lands of the Graal Alliance. As Zero spoke, his body rapidly transformed. A huge, 40 meters tall divine golden lion shot out into existence, towering in front of Dorian in all its majestic fury. Its simple appearance was enough to inspire both fear and awe, a glorious creature out of legend. What is this? As Dorian felt the symbols land on him, he clapped his hands together, trying to shake them off. The symbols refused to move, standing all the same. As he clapped, he suddenly realized that moving had become incredibly difficult. Even a simple movement was much harder to handle. The symbols that had landed on him were affecting his soul, slowing him down. His soul rebelled against such a delay and rapidly began to burn the energy off. It would take only a half-dozen seconds for Dorian to fully throw off the effects of the ability, shaking free. This ability isn't that useful most of the time, but was one I sought out after I learned of its existence. It was one I got specifically to help me hunt down other anomalies. When Zero spoke in his divine golden lion form, his words shook the air itself, causing the fading smoke and steam to tremble. The angelic halo he bore grew even more powerful, an aura of such grandeur pressing down upon Dorian it felt insurmountable. It traps a being in place, drawing on the mystic law of stillness. For an anomaly, that means you can't flee and, as Zero finished this sentence, he raised his head. Above him, a massive ball of energy formed, made up of gold and white particles that shivered. This energy was gathered from the very air itself around Zero, and the unending supply of energy within him, all in a split second. You can't transform. Whoosh! A concentrated beam of raw might shot forward, moving at an extremely fast pace. It melted through the air, destroying space itself as it ripped through the air of the underground cavern, headed straight for Dorian. The attack had taken only a small second for Zero to form and launch. In that time, Dorian had almost fully removed the restrictions latched upon his soul by Zero's myriad restriction ability. The freakish symbols had done as Zero claimed, preventing him from fleeing. Unfortunately, almost freeing wasn't enough. The concentrated beam of energy slammed into a stream of near-invisible energy from the law of original sin, weakening it, and then slammed into Dorian's black luster shielding, and then into the layer of defensive energy from the law of gluttony, and then simultaneously into Dorian's perfect body and the raw defensive prowess of a pride-boosted Empyrean vampire. And ripped through all of that, leaving torn gaps in reality itself as the beam shot into and through Dorian, obliterating most of his chest and destroying his heart. Chapter 226 Breakthrough. A huge explosion of stone dust scattered into the air as Zero's annihilation beam shot through Dorian and melted into the ground. The dust mixed with frozen particles of ice, obscuring Dorian's form from even the strongest eyes for a few scant moments. Dorian felt an overwhelming sense of loss. His abnormally powerful willpower allowed him to remain conscious as the totality of the injuries he had suffered settled upon him. He had tried to shift forms 6 times before the beam hit him. Unfortunately, the trap Zero had set had taken its toll and prevented him from escaping. For a short, frozen moment, Dorian felt his body tremble on the edge of death. Asra, heal me. Use my growth points, now. Rapidly, he issued a mental command without hesitation. Acknowledged. Asra didn't question him as she automatically set about using the vast store of energy Dorian still had left in his soul. A frighteningly large amount of growth energy vanished as Dorian forcibly regenerated, his body healing at a visibly fast rate. Strands of flesh shot upward as his organs began to reknit themselves, expelling the traces of annihilation energy. An unsettling, crawling sensation flooded into Dorian's chest as he began to rapidly heal. Meanwhile, an onerous feeling of strain settled upon Dorian's soul as he acted as a conduit for this torrent of energy. The regeneration process took only a couple of scant seconds, but the amount of energy expended reached a huge sum. This type of regeneration wasn't something Dorian had pulled out of a hat, nor was it something he could do over and over. He had used his growth energy, in the past, to regenerate before. Never had he done it for something of this scale, where his body had to reject traces of powerful law energy that were set trying to ravage him from the inside out. Whoosh! Dorian's body flashed with light as the huge hole in his chest vanished and his body was almost completely healed. A burst of wind cleared the air around him as he healed, scattering the cloud of dust. Asra, what's my remaining growth energy at? The moment he finished healing, he sent a mental query over to her. Roughly 178,398 growth points remain in store. Asra replied coolly. Dorian couldn't help but frown fiercely. From millions of points of growth energy just a short while ago to less than 200,000, he wouldn't be able to use his growth energy to regenerate again. After Zero had launched his all-out attack, he had returned back to his humanoid form. He stood floating in the air as he looked down at the remains of his attack, waiting for the cloud of stone dust that had formed to clear. When Dorian cleared it after healing, Zero finally managed to see the end results of his handiwork. Oh? Zero blinked slowly as he saw Dorian come back from what should have been death, a small frown appearing on the anomaly's face. The attack he had used was imbued with his angelic class grasp of the law of annihilation. It was not something that could be easily recovered from or blocked. Even a being with the strong constant regeneration should have died. Dorian's ability to regenerate his body so quickly through the use of growth energy was only possible because of Asra. The complex calculations and cell-by-cell restoration was not something even a person with an angelic class soul spell matrix could so easily handle. Asra was uniquely positioned, with her huge store of data and calculating nature, to be able to handle such a task. You just don't know when to stay down, do you? Zero's body shot down to the ground and landed on it with a resounding thud. I've never been one to follow. Dorian's will burned with fighting spirit as his heart pounded. A lot of the worry and fear that had begun to build up in him through the course of this brutal battle seemed to have dissipated with his near-death experience. Off to the side, hundreds of Greycons were slowly moving towards the battle site. By this point, everything within 100 meters of here had been completely flattened, leaving only rubble and ruins. Dorian stretched out his hand to the right, towards the mass of growling Greycons. I look at myself more as a leader. He smiled. Lesser magnetic manipulation. As he activated the ability, he pulled hard on the energy in his soul, once more driving a torrent of energy through his body. Whoosh! He jerked his arm forward, pulling along a full 200 of the undead Lord-class Greycons. Most of them had yet to expand and were in their normal state, surprised by his sudden appearance. With bodies that were covered in metal and massive metal swords they wielded in their hands, they were extremely easy to latch onto. As he pulled them forward, the ground beneath him shattered anew, stone and rock shards shooting off into the air. He exerted a huge amount of force just keeping himself still, relying upon his extremely strong physical body. The sheer force required to throw so many Greycons was considerable, enough so that Dorian's body creaked under the strain, even in its highly enhanced state. In mid-air, all 200 Greycons expanded, transforming into towering behemoths. They carried the same momentum they held from when they were small, however, still hurtling towards Zero. All of the Greycons may have been Lord class, but none of them possessed any flight-related abilities. In fact, most of them were rather helpless to slow themselves, relying upon brute force for almost everything. At best, they could use the energy of their soul to resist Dorian's lesser magnetic manipulation a little, but not enough to make a difference. All 200 of those huge, Lord-class Greycons sailed through the air towards Zero in mere moments, blotting out the proverbial sky. HMPH. Insignificant worms. Zero's frown deepened as he clenched both of his fists. The angelic halo around his head flashed with light as he then knocked his two fists together. Blood-red energy shot out from Zero, covering him in a huge suit of red armor. This towering, 8-meter-tall creation then physically separated itself from Zero, moving seemingly autonomously. A pair of large, energy swords formed in each plated hand of the red energy golem. BOOM. The red energy golem leapt up into the air and intercepted the Greycons. BOOM. BOOM. Several explosions of energy rang out as the energy golem sent out several sword strikes at the Lord-class Greycons. Each strike from the golem obliterated half a dozen Greycons, the destructive annihilation energy it was imbued with tearing apart its enemies. My will cannot be stopped, brother. This is something I must do. I am sorry. Zero's body was covered with a sheen of energy once more. This time, however, the energy was a pale pink instead of a vibrant red. As undead Graycon bodies fell to the floor, Zero shot forward at an extremely fast pace. The energy coating his body appeared to be some sort of enhancement power, rapidly boosting his speed. It took him only a split moment to cross the distance between Dorian and himself. When Dorian saw how easily Zero handled the Graycons, using a method that didn't even require his attention, he felt a string of panic creep its way into his heart. He didn't let it control him as he forced himself to remain calm, his Empyrean vampire form standing strong. In the split moment it took Zero to reach Dorian, Dorian recognized Zero's attack and adapted. Dorian abandoned his focus from most of his laws, and amped up his focus on two laws in particular. The law of lust and the law of pride, two demonic laws he had a strong grasp on. Time. Slow down, now. He pulled as hard as he could on the law of lust, enchaining his perception of time as much as possible. His law of pride helped compound the effects of the law of lust, not only allowing his body to handle its increased strain, but also enhancing his raw might. The world around him shifted and slowed down. Zero's blurringly fast-moving form slowed down to one that was still extremely fast but visible. By this point, Zero had already arrived. Whoa! Dorian ducked to the side as Zero punched out at him, narrowly dodging Zero's fist. The enemy anomaly followed up the punch with a roundhouse kick, one that Dorian had to throw himself down on the ground to avoid. A second later and Dorian was forced to dodge 7 different attacks, each one an attack he barely avoided by the skin of his teeth. His body tingled with exhaustion as he was stretched to his limits. Meanwhile, Zero seemed to be, of all things, growing faster. Dorian's left arm cracked as one of Zero's punches glanced off it. The slight contact was enough to break it, a few hints of annihilation energy knocking against it and blasting through his defenses. The glancing blow sent him tumbling backwards more than a dozen meters. This isn't working. I need more speed. Dorian's eyes blazed with light as he drew even harder on the energy in his soul, pulling upon the law of lust with all his might. More, 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 give me more, I need it, I must have it. His desires grew overwhelming as blood began to drip down from his eyes. He was overextending both his mind and soul, stretching them to the absolute limits. Dorian saw Zero's fist come rushing in towards his face. By this point, Zero was moving so quickly that Dorian, with his injuries, was unable to dodge in time. This single fist looked like the kiss of death to Dorian, piercing through the air with inevitability. More. As Dorian saw the fatal blow crash towards him, he felt a reaction set off in his soul. A light, warm feeling abruptly began to swarm him. Not a moment later, a feeling of epiphany settled upon Dorian's shoulders. I need more. And by needing more, by desiring more, by wanting more, I can draw more from the world around me. And from that, I gain more of what almost no one can get. His body trembled as he closed his eyes. Time. Dorian felt as if he was one with reality around him. He could innately feel the flow of energy in his body and soul, tracing every iota of power, every minute particle. In particular, Dorian's soul seemed to be adapting to this energy perfectly, allowing him to continue his epiphany past normal, reasonable limits. In what felt like hours, but happened in an instant, Dorian's understanding of the law of lust shot up. Its first spurt of growth brought it all the way to 50% understanding, growing without pause in Dorian's mind till he reached this point. However, as the energy flowed in Dorian's soul without pause, his epiphany continued. He broke through to 60%, and then to 70%, and then to 80%. At this point, reality around Dorian had slowed down to roughly half speed. Zero's fist was a quarter of a meter away from Dorian's face, crashing towards him with abandon. Despite that, Dorian continued to break through, from 80% to 90%, and then from 90% to 95%. Energy vibrated in Dorian's soul without pause as his energy levels expanded. This was an epiphany the likes of which Dorian had never seen. His powerful soul could handle king-class understandings already, making him a vessel that was ready to be filled. As an anomaly, he had a much easier time understanding any law. This combined with his powerful desires, and led him to where he was now. From 95% to 100%, Dorian broke through and mastered the law of lust to completion. Dorian opened his eyes and gazed upon a world that had been slowed down to the absolute maximum his law of lust could currently boost his speed by. A value made possible by his abnormally powerful body that could handle the enormous strain. A world where time was slowed down to a mere 10% its normal speed. Dorian smiled. Chapter 227 Facing Death. Zero's fists rushed towards Dorian's face in slow motion. Dorian could make out small streams of red energy flicker all around it as it moved right at him with unerring accuracy, crackling with power. HMPH. Casually, Dorian stepped to the side of it, dodging it with ease. The punch flew past him, as did Zero's body as the powerful warrior continued his blitz. A look of startlement was slowly beginning to form on his face as he realized his attack had missed. The moment Zero noticed that, the pale pink energy transformed into the deep red energy from before. Zero's movements slowed down ever so slightly as his defenses and raw attack power enhanced, costing him slightly in speed. The anomaly's body then began to shift, turning towards where Dorian was standing. Zero's right leg stamped down hard onto the rocky floor, sending out a webwork of cracks as he forcefully halted himself. Once more, Zero punched out with an extremely powerful punch. And, once more, Dorian dodged it with almost casual ease. Well then, Dorian spoke aloud as he saw the results of his newfound speed, his eyes blazing with emotion as he looked at the anomaly that had nearly murdered him. How unfortunate for you. Boom. Dorian's body transformed into a blur as he ran up and punched Zero in the face. The resulting impact sent Zero's body flying a dozen meters through the air, Dorian's eminently powerful Empyrean vampire form proving more than strong enough to manhandle the slow-moving Secondborn. Dorian quickly chased after Zero, moving so quickly he caught up to the anomaly in just a split second. Then, while Zero was still flying away from the force of Dorian's first punch, Dorian raised his right arm and slammed the anomaly in the stomach, sending the Secondborn soaring off to Dorian's left. Both times, Zero's eyes managed to perceive the incoming attack, but he was physically unable to block the blow. The warrior was able to shift some of the red energy that covered him, but not enough to block out Dorian's blindly fast strikes. Pure ecstasy flowed in Dorian's veins as the energy from the law of lust flooded his body. He watched as Zero flew away in slow motion, feeling an incredible sense of power. At the same time, however, he couldn't help but frown. Why is it so difficult to use any of the other laws? Both times now, when he went into attack, he attempted to activate the law of wrath. This law greatly boosted his attack strength and, when it came to direct attacks, was his most powerful tool. He should have been able to blast apart Zero's weakly raised barrier of energy in an instant. Instead, however, Dorian felt as if it was almost impossible to access any law save for the law of lust. Even the law of original sin was something he couldn't draw upon. His body was still boosted a bit by the law of pride, but it was a boost that was rapidly fading away. Small bits of red annihilation energy had singed his hands ever so slightly, minor injuries he'd gained from punching Zero. Without wrath energy boost his attack, the annihilation energy was free to run amok. As he questioned this, a piece of innate knowledge settled in his mind, born from his new understanding of the law of lust. He was currently operating in a specific, special state the law of lust could activate. The law of pride, when mastered, had its super state that Dorian had seen leader control. Conversely, the law of lust had its own version of a prideful, super state, a speedy state. In this speedy state, Dorian could draw upon the law of lust to enhance his perception of time, dependent on the strain his body could bear. A regular being would be able to reach a speed of 2 to 3 times as fast. For Dorian, who possessed the body of one of the strongest beings in existence, a natural king-class Empyrean vampire, he could stretch his perception of time to an incredible 10 times. It was insanely powerful. It did, however, have its downsides. The energy from the law of lust was naturally created and formed to operate at different speeds. It was an internal part of its law, after all. This was not the same for Dorian's other laws. The only law of his that felt like it might be possible to use was the law of original sin. However, at 10 times speed, Dorian still found it impossible to grasp onto. His understanding of the law needed to fully integrate the law of lust into it, and that was only possible when all of his demonic laws reached completion. Anything else created an unsustainable imbalance. Still, Dorian clenched his fists as he looked back up. Zero's body was still flying through the air in slow motion. In real time, less than 1 second had passed between his 2 attacks and his moments of pondering. I refuse to believe I can't hurt you. Dorian's body transformed into a blur as he rushed forward again and attacked. Dorian's speed was already at an extremely high level in his normal state, with a perception that operated on a far higher level than regular beings thanks to his strong soul. While Zero was quicker than him, it was only by roughly 10 to 20%. Very noticeable, yes, but not impossible to respond to. Dorian's perception boosted his speed to 1000% its normal rate, meaning his advantage over Zero in terms of speed was essentially insurmountable. Dorian appeared in front of where Zero was hurtling towards in a split second. He quickly studied Zero's body, specifically any areas that were vulnerable, like his eyes and throat. In every weak spot, Dorian saw that the red energy that protected Zero had a heavier hue to it, as if it was more concentrated. Zero's life had been one of constant war. In that time, the anomaly had adapted to that by consistently protecting himself in whatever manner he could. After achieving the angelic class, Zero realized that while his humanoid form wasn't his most powerful one, it was the easier form he could use when manipulating annihilation energy. Its small stature but considerable power made it a perfect choice. Damn, it's really like a suit of armor. As Dorian stared at the concentrated red hue of energy, he could instinctively tell that it would be a very bad idea to try to force his way through that. Zero was only able to create a few spots that deadly, even with his essentially infinite energy stores, showing the absolute prowess in those defenses. Zero was taking Dorian completely seriously, holding back nothing at all and not underestimating him. It was the smart choice, but left Dorian in a sore spot. Still, Zero couldn't protect his entire body. Boom! A slowed, but still resounding shockwave spread out as Dorian raised his right elbow and then slammed it into the side of Zero's chest. The ground beneath Dorian shattered, stone and rock debris flying into the air in slow motion. The wind gushed in behind Dorian as he moved supernaturally fast, pulling some of the rocks and stone shrapnel into the air behind him as he moved to where Zero had been sent flying. He then punched him again, and again, and again, and again, and then 12 more times. Each blow contained the full force that Dorian could muster, powered by his perfect body ability. He tried to activate a few of his other abilities, like the touching light ability, but found that any energy that extended beyond his physique was extremely hard to stabilize. He had to rely on brute force. At this point in time, from Dorian's first punch to his last, roughly 2 seconds had passed. By now, hundreds of pieces of rock and stone floated in the air, slowly moving upwards. Dorian knocked a few out of his field of view as he looked down at Zero's floating form. The full impact of all of his blows hadn't yet been realized by Zero's body due to Dorian's extreme speed. Still, the red energy shield that protected Zero was fluctuating in several parts, a huge amount of force successfully transferring through. Dorian's arms and hands were covered in burning red energy. In his speedy state, limited by the energy sources he could access, he found it much harder to expel and resist the annihilation energy. Abruptly, Dorian raised his right arm, glaring down at Zero's floating body. He then slammed it downward with all of his might, focusing his full strength into this one single blow at Zero's back. Boom! A large crater formed in the earth as huge chunks of stone shattered upward. Zero's body lay at the epicenter of this crater, smashed down into it by the tremendous power behind Dorian's attack. His body blurred as he sprinted a dozen meters backwards, his chest heaving from exertion. Going all out while in his speedy state was extremely tiring, draining him of both energy and strength. Whoosh! It took only a single thought for him to release his speedy state. Immediately, the red energy that had been eating away at his arms and hands was smacked backwards as Dorian drew upon all of his laws once more, returning to his full physical strength. All the slow-moving shards of rock, the scattered dust and minutely moving stone chunks, all of them abruptly sped up as time returned to normal. Wheeze, wheeze. Dorian's chest continued to heave as he caught his breath and allowed his hands and arms to quickly regenerate using the recovery powers of the Law of Sloth. The energy from the Law of Sloth was his most effective tool when it came to helping push out and heal from the annihilation energy. You got pretty fast. An ominous voice echoed out as several large chunks of stone cracked before Dorian's eyes. A moment later, Zero's body slowly rose into view as the anomaly stood up. Stone dust cascaded off his body as he stamped down hard, blasting all the debris off of him. No, no way. Dorian stuttered, staring at him in disbelief. His lightning-fast attacks had all been extremely powerful, even if he could only use the law of lust for them. The might of his physical body was far beyond most reasonable realms. Despite that, Zero looked mostly fine. Cough. Zero pounded his chest as he spat out a small amount of blood. When his blood came into contact with the air, it instantly burst on fire, dissipating to nothingness thanks to the overpowering aura Zero gave off. You're the third being that has made me bleed. I didn't think you had a trump card like this in store for me. Zero's shoulders shrugged as he hunched down slightly. He raised his arms in a guard position, his eyes pinpointed onto Dorian. But it won't be enough, Firstborn. I cannot be stopped. Zero took a step forward. Boom. I am the end. His red aura of energy expanded, blasting forward in a shockwave that sundered the air. Like hell you are. Dorian clenched his fists as he drew upon the law of lust to the maximum once more, entering his speedy state. His soul writhed in agony as he fully overextended himself. He had officially drawn upon too much law energy, exceeding his limits even with the spontaneous growth of his soul that he got for reaching completion with the law of lust. While Dorian was powerful, when compared to an angelic class being, the amount of law energy he could handle was definitely smaller. Still, he pushed himself forward regardless. Reality slowed down. Dorian burst past the shockwave of energy, his entire body undergoing a burning sensation as the annihilation energy sought to rip him apart. He dashed right up to Zero, his eyes gleaming. Zero's left arm was in the process of being raised to block his attack while his right arm remained still. Dorian snorted as he lobbed a punch into Zero's left shoulder, smashing the warrior off to the side. Once again, Zero's body flew out in slow motion, knocked away by the powerful strike. He may be tough, but I am still far, far faster than him. Dorian refused to believe that he couldn't seriously injure the warrior and take him down. The fact that he managed to injure Zero, however minor, was proof that the anomaly wasn't invincible. Twice more Dorian rushed forward and intercepted Zero, lashing out with a strong blow each time. Dorian felt his blood seem to boil with power as he refused to give up and continued his attack. As Zero flew through the air, his right arm had not continued to remain still. In the tiny moment that Dorian took to bring forth his first 3 strikes, Zero's right arm had moved steadily forward. Trails of red light began to shine from Zero's eyes as he focused, seemingly ignoring Dorian's blows. Just as Dorian was about to launch his 4th strike, he felt something latch onto his right leg with a crushing, agonizing grip. What? Dorian jerked his head down in shock. A small, jagged tear in reality had appeared right next to his legs. And from that tear in reality a familiar-looking hand had emerged, covered in red energy. Dorian's head spun up as he looked at Zero in horror. Zero's right arm ended in a second tear in reality. No, Dorian only managed to utter one more word before. Crack. Zero's hand crushed down as it broke Dorian's leg and ankle, particles of red annihilation energy burrowing into him. Dorian's grasp of his speedy state was already an extremely delicate maneuver that required his full concentration. This abrupt intrusion shattered that focus, returning reality around him back to its normal speed. Dorian couldn't help but to yell as the pain swept over him. Despite his clouded mind, he immediately raised an arm, covering it in wrath energy as he slashed downward. Instead of trying to cut off Zero's arm, however, Dorian tried to cut off his own leg while simultaneously attempting to jump backwards. The powerful annihilation energy that protected Zero was extremely durable. Dorian had experienced enough of it to know that his wrath energy wouldn't be able to break through it in one go. However, his leg was relatively undefended at the current moment. As long as he weakened the effects of his perfect body for a split second, he should be able to slice it off. SHKK. Unfortunately, just as Dorian was about to slide it off, a webwork of red energy shot up and covered his left, blocking his blow. Boom. A small explosion of energy shook the air as the two energies collided. Dorian's leg broke in several more places, the pain forcing tears to his eyes. It took me a while to get used to how you attacked. Zero's voice was cold as he expanded the tear in reality and walked through it, picking Dorian up casually and throwing him a dozen meters. Dorian landed on the ground hard, barely remaining standing as he focused everything he could to push out the annihilation energy that was currently trying to ravage him from the inside out. His soul was overextended, however, forcing him to use only a small amount of energy, barely enough to hold it back. You even managed to crack one of my ribs. Zero casually appeared in front of Dorian, looking down at him. Zero touched his chest, wincing ever so slightly. His body was extremely powerful, and as a result of that power, any injuries he took would need huge amounts of energy to heal. As a creature with virtually endless energy thanks to his divine golden lion bloodline, that wasn't a big deal, but healing the wounds still took time. For Dorian to injure him despite being barely an official king-class warrior was a very serious matter. Blood spewed from Dorian's mouth as Zero's aura forced him down to his knees. Dorian's vision was blurred as he felt the world seemed to turn against him, leaving him shaking. Even then, he didn't give up. He froze as he prepared to transform into his Grey Manter bloodline. No, we can't have that. Zero seemed to predict his actions as he spoke aloud, flicking a finger at Dorian. Strange, mysterious symbols appeared in the air around Dorian, locking down and slamming into him instantly. Even uninjured, Dorian was unable to react to them in time, let alone now. Zero's myriad restriction ability activated in full, preventing him from shifting forms or even moving. I've killed and absorbed enough of our brethren to know how we work. Zero held his right hand out to the side. A moment later, a large, glowing white sword appeared, created by some unknown ability. This sword gained a red hue as Zero spread his annihilation energy all along its edge. No, Dorian's thoughts remained clouded by pain and muddled by his overextended soul. He was just barely aware of what was happening, but helpless to stop it. I cannot die here. Memories of Helena flashed in his heart. He had just finally managed to start what might be a real future in this world. How could he be willing to abandon all of that now, after everything he had been through? He struggled with all of his might, blood dripping from his eyes as he focused his full force of will on Zero, commanding fate to change. Zero froze for a moment. The sword he held in his hand shook briefly. The area around him seemed to lock up, leaving him unable to move. A small shockwave shook the air as Zero shivered and broke that lock, freeing himself as he turned his head to stare at Dorian. You are full of tricks, firstborn. Zero smiled down at Dorian. But this is a fate you cannot avoid, no matter how you rail against it. Dorian could manipulate fate with his soul, with a level of skill and power that outstripped all other anomalies. Zero, with his much more powerful angelic class soul, could as well. While his skill wasn't on par with Dorian's, it was just enough to stalemate Dorian's efforts. Dorian gazed up at Zero, despair slipping its way into his heart. A spontaneous breakthrough couldn't just solve all of his problems for him. This wasn't a fairy tale, no matter how magical his existence felt. It was reality. He had done everything he could. And he still failed. Zero was not only an angelic class being, but also possessed a divine bloodline, an abnormal soul, and an unworldly grasp of the law of annihilation. He was the second-born, a creature that had known constant war and battle his entire life. Zero pulled the sword to the side and then aimed it at Dorian's chest. The second-born slowly raised it up, preparing to plunge it into Dorian's heart. Dorian simply stared at it, coming to a somber realization. He was going to die. There was nothing he could do to stop Zero. The fused part of Euclid's soul never roused or made any movements. Dorian was unable to switch forms and teleport or phase out of reality. Manipulating fate had failed. His soul was overextended and it was impossible to draw upon any of the laws. No artifacts he possessed would be able to do anything at all in a battle of this scale. This was the end. A single tear formed and fell from Dorian's visage as Zero sighed. I'm sorry. Farewell, brother. Dorian shut his eyes. I'm sorry, Helena. SSHKK. Dorian slowly opened his eyes. Zero's blade stood frozen a few inches from Dorian's heart, just moments from rending his flesh and dissipating his soul. As Dorian's eyes trailed upward, he saw a long, wooden staff rest against the hilt of that blade, freezing its momentum. BOM. A moment later, a huge explosion shook the air. Red energy crackled as several shockwaves spread out, knocking over all of the undead Greycons that were still milling about in the background, hundreds of meters away. The nearby Gworan ice waterfall shot out haphazardly, waves of solid ice splattering about the city at random. Miraculously, Dorian was completely unaffected by the blast. When he blinked and cleared his vision, the sword that had been about to kill him was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he saw a new figure appear in front of him. A proud-looking monkey, wearing a bead necklace and wielding a long staff in its left hand, its right hand pointed out in front of it with its palm facing forward and steaming. It seems we arrived just in time. These eyes of mine yet work. The Monkey King, Sun Wukong, turned around and gave Dorian a small smile. Dorian, a loud yell as a familiar-looking anomaly, Aaron, appeared, wearing his full set of metal wolf armor. Next to him stood another anomaly Dorian was familiar, Zaffin. He didn't know the food-obsessed being super well, but knew a bit about him through Aaron. Standing behind those two were 4 other anomalies, 3 he didn't recognize, but 1 he did. Hello, Dorian. Mello's eyes gleamed as he waved casually at Dorian, giving him a thumbs up and a confident smile. Next to him stood a man that seemed to be made completely out of glowing, translucent crystal rocks, with a face carved from that rough crystal, towering 3 meters high. Another seemed to be half woman, half plant, with green eyes that glowed ominously. The last had dark red skin and looked vaguely like a titan, except one that was much smaller and leaner, with stark blue hair. We're here to help. Chapter 228 Zero vs. Wukong. Dorian didn't reply. Instead, he remained sitting on the ground and focused his entire body on healing. He released any abilities he had active and stopped trying to draw on various laws. His body immediately began to regenerate while his soul calmed down. The various injuries he'd accrued slowly began to heal as he entered a zen-like state of meditation. His focus was at such a high level due to the sheer scale of his fight with Zero that the feeling came almost naturally to him. His soul rapidly began to rejuvenate, easing the strain he was feeling. The injuries to his body healed slower due to the high power of his physique, but they still started to heal nonetheless. Monkey. Zero's voice was a dark growl as he stared at Sun Wukong. A feeling of rage carried in his tone as he glared at the powerful warrior. Lion. Sun Wukong merely nodded back politely. Behind him, the rest of the anomalies that had all arrived waited quietly, knowing the impact. I am not the same as I was before. Zero raised up his right hand. Whoosh! The glowing white sword had been sent flying away after Sun Wukong deflected it, shot through the air and landed in Zero's hand, giving off a few sparks of red energy. I can see that. The monkey raised up his own right hand slowly while storing his staff securely on his back. Zero snorted, his eyes boring into Sun Wukong. This land of endless death will be your grave, monkey. For you to have come to me on this day, I should be thanking the heavens. Despite his confident bluster, Zero's entire body tensed up as he stared at Sun Wukong, as if he was prepared to flee at a moment's notice. If Dorian had been able to look up, he would have been shocked. For, it almost looked as though Zero feared Sun Wukong. Zero held his sword up, pointing it to the roof. Almost immediately, the air around Zero began to swarm as red energy began to condense. His entire body was covered in a protective layer of annihilation energy, twisting and sparking ferociously. A small ball of red energy started to form roughly a meter above his sword. You are far too weak, child, to think of threatening me. Sun Wukong's voice took on a grand, royal air. All of a sudden, an overpowering aura burst free from the monkey, one full of majestic might. Zero flinched just the tiniest bit when he sensed this, but otherwise maintained his focus as he continued to gather energy above his head. Curse magic. Sun Wukong whispered quietly. Release the 7th seal. Herculean strength. As soon as he finished speaking, his right hand hovered over the left side of his chest, right on his heart. He then stabbed down with his fingers, blue light sliding off them to form the shape of a riveting seal. This seal sank into the flesh of his chest, and seemed to react, taking on a dark glow. Sun Wukong's body began to gleam as his muscles bulged, his physical form transforming from that of a small, average-sized monkey to a hulking, 3-meter-tall muscular ape. His skin itself stretched outward, veins popping out as every fiber of his being seemed to become energized and mighty. I am Sun Wukong, the almighty ruler of the Graal Alliance. His voice boomed in the air, the sheer force of presence he bore visibly causing all of the other anomalies except Mello to flinch. Right after that, in another silent whisper, he casts another spell. Release the sixth seal, Golden Body. Another collection of energy swarmed from his hands towards his heart, an image of a seal forming and sinking into his chest. Sun Wukong's body that had bulged out with muscles began to condense, shrinking back down to around 2 meters in height. The air around him seemed to solidify, as if his body had become incredibly dense and was beginning to physically affect the world around him. Find authorized novels in WebNovel, faster updates, better experience. Please click www.webnovel.com for visiting. His every movement was imbued with virile energy, derived from the law of might, one of the strongest laws that focused on physical power, and the law that the Monkey King had mastered completely. You wish to thank the heavens? Child, I was born from the heavens themselves. Another blast of aura soared out. This time, it physically forced all of the other anomalies to take a step back. Only Mello and Zero managed to stand their ground. Dorian was somehow able to ignore all of it due to his meditative state causing the aura to wash over him. Release the fifth seal, Soul Acceleration. Release the fourth seal, Latent Burn. Sun Wukong's body shook, outwardly not changing much. His eyes seemed to become endless, gaining a depth that could not be matched. His physical form seemed to become even stronger and mightier, all while standing still. As this happened, he winced, his mouth twitching. A small spurt of blood spat free from his lips but was quietly blasted into nothingness by his raw aura. Zero's ball of energy had swollen to be a full 3 meters in width by this point. Once it reached that level, Zero's sword shifted slightly. Abruptly, that energy siphoned off from the ball above and rapidly began to become absorbed by Zero's sword. Red veins popped out in Zero's body as this went on, causing his eyes to glow brightly. This is my ultimate technique, monkey. I didn't intend to use this on you, but instead on him. But I suppose you can help me test it out. As Zero spoke, his voice became infused with the essence of the law of annihilation. Everything about him, in fact, had become infused with the law. His sword seemed to be made of red, annihilation flames, while the red energy that had encompassed him was now glued to his body like a set of translucent scales. Zero looked like an epic god from legend, his appearance giving off a feeling of overwhelming power. Before I had my annihilation mode, you might have had a chance. Zero slowly took a step forward. That single step, not an attack nor a punch or a stomp, just a light step, caused a sonic shockwave to spread out. The Greycons in the background had long since been flung back hundreds of meters, as had most of the loose rubble. The rocky floor beneath shattered once more, forming a massive crater of jagged stone. Much of this stone was obliterated as soon as it cut upwards. The pieces that weren't were sent flying off in the distance, infused with annihilation energy and destroying anything in their path. But now, Zero shook his head, confidence filling his voice. Even Father himself could not stand against me. Sun Wukong looked at Zero's fearsome appearance and then slowly shook his head. If you cannot even defeat me, you will stand no chance against that man. And I am no ally of his. Sun Wukong simply shrugged. He raised his right hand and then placed it on his chest, right in front of his heart. Prove to me your power, lion. Release the third seal. Nature and compass. Sun Wukong's aura changed. Well, rather than changed, it was more correct to say. It exploded into light. Dorian's meditation had just reached a point where he could now open his eyes. His body was rapidly regenerating, as was his soul. He was still heavily injured, but if it came down to it, he could once more fight. The moment he opened his eyes was the moment Sun Wukong activated his third and second seal. Everything in Dorian's vision suddenly became 3 shades lighter. Sun Wukong was a warrior, right down to his core. Ever since he was born with his magical, future-seeing eyes, Sun Wukong had focused on growing stronger so he could handle any enemy that came his way. With his almost all-seeing powers, life was easy for him. One day, however, he met an enemy that he could not defeat. An enemy that was so much more powerful than he was, that even if every single attack he made was perfect, every single strike he launched was immaculate, he would still lose. And that enemy was a woman named Asra. Or, rather, a dragon. A wise jade dragon. Asra was a genius in her own right, possessing a wise mind and incredible martial prowess, as well as the body of a monstrously powerful dragon. She had been intrigued by Sun Wukong's mystical eyes and opted to befriend him, intent on learning more. She had had dreams of compiling a list of all living creatures and their characteristics, and she had never heard of a monkey quite like Sun Wukong. Sun Wukong was fine with it. After all, what he sought was the power to live without worry, and Asra seemed to have that. Like that, Sun Wukong joined her as she traveled through the 30,000 worlds. They dueled each other 100 times during their first year traveling. Asra won all 100 duels. Sun Wukong learned a lot from her. He learned that he had been a master-class expert when he met her, while Asra was king-class. The discrepancy in power between them was gargantuan at the time. He also learned that all the martial techniques she used were not actually her own. Those moves had been taught to her by a young genius she'd met not too long ago, a man by the name Ukeli Shorn. A warrior that, according to Asra, was obsessed with the ongoing wars with the demon race that were currently sweeping the 30,000 worlds. Before their meeting, Sun Wukong had lived his life in a small mountain range in a small lesser world that few people cared about. After a year traveling with Asra, his mind had greatly expanded. There were countless millions of races, incredible dragons that possessed fearsome power and ferocious demons that could obliterate a country with a wave of the hand. Sun Wukong truly understood how weak he was, despite his miraculous eyes, and set about on a promise to fix all of that. He pledged his formal discipleship to become Asra's student, and Asra had accepted. Even now, Sun Wukong never understood why such a kind, wise, and graceful lady would care about someone like him. He knew his eyes were special, but that still couldn't account for everything. From there on, Sun Wukong had rapidly grown stronger. As he grew, he found that he was limited by something. His body. While his eyes were truly divine, his body was not but a regular, simple monkey. In fact, as he later found out, his body was actually even weaker than a regular monkey. His divine eyes had badly damaged his future potential, making every increase in strength difficult. They were half a blessing, but also half a curse. He never found out why his eyes were this way. Asra had thought it was a random stroke of heavenly luck, a twist of fate that couldn't be accounted for or predicted. The strain his body suffered from when he pulled upon his eyes was rather extreme, especially as his power grew. His eyes required a huge amount of energy that other warriors or creatures would use to power their physique. He realized, over time, that he needed a way to increase the power of his body if he ever wanted to be able to fight at a high level. Even with his eyes of God, that could see through fate, if he wasn't physically strong enough, losing a fight would remain a possibility. Asra had hammered that lesson into him time and time again. So he took up two practices. He studied the law of might, using that law to help him break past barrier after barrier. And he studied a vein of highly abstruse curse magic. Specifically, the inner seals of curse magic. Throughout his lifetime, Sun Wukong had created 7 inner seals. Each one possessed mystical powers that were formed through mystical rituals and raw effort. Each seal had absorbed a sizable portion of his life energy, his cultivation, and his own soul itself to form. The smaller the number of the seal, the more power and life he had imbued into it. Activating any of his seals was extremely trying on his body, but by doing so, not only could he vastly increase his prowess, but he could also gain additional abilities or powers. The aura Sun Wukong gave off thanks to his 3rd seal was one that emanated beautiful light. Everything within range of that light was now an area under Sun Wukong's partial control. He could manipulate pressure, twist the air, or rupture the earth with his will alone. This seal was one that drew upon the fabric of reality itself, granting him incredible power for a brief time. It was only possible for him to use this one because all of his previous seals had enhanced his body to an ungodly degree, changing his physique from that of a regular, weak monkey to a legendary creature that could handle such a strain. Zero's body shot forward like an infinitely powerful meteor as he charged at Sun Wukong. The brutal, red energy that Zero exuded clashed with Sun Wukong's godly aura, causing multiple shockwaves to shake out. The ground beneath Zero had long since been obliterated. The center of this once majestic city was now a ruined war zone, full of huge craters and jagged chunks of rock. Sun Wukong watched as Zero drew close. Behind Sun Wukong, the various other anomalies were barely able to react to the ongoing fight, even Dorian. Everything was happening at a level that only the angelic class experts seemed able to react to. They were only unharmed still right now because Sun Wukong's aura was shielding them. The air itself seemed to be slowing Zero down. The powerful anomaly was flying through the air, but at a speed that was at least a third what he seemed to be expecting. Despite that, a vicious smile appeared on his face as continued to fight his way forward, throwing off Sun Wukong's aura. Sun Wukong frowned slightly. Thundering winds. Flush gale. Sun Wukong vanished. An instant later, he reappeared right next to Zero. By the time Zero realized the monkey was right next to him, Sun Wukong was already attacking. Rumbling earth. Boulder breaker. A massive explosion blasted out as Sun Wukong punched Zero right in the chest. This punch created an image of a boulder shattering under an incredible amount of force. A punch that Dorian himself had used before. This explosion tried to sweep out and envelop everyone within hundreds of meters. However, as the explosive force tried to escape, it instead rebounded on the glowing light of Sun Wukong's aura. As a result, it blasted back inwards and slammed into Zero's form, repeatedly, more than a dozen times. The subsequent impacts carried enough force to obliterate a mountain. The power of the attack forced its way through Zero's protective annihilation barrier, smashing into his chest and knocking him backwards. Instead of being flung away hundreds of meters, Zero likewise rebounded off the glowing light of Sun Wukong's aura. His body then transformed into what Dorian would call a pinball as Zero was knocked back and forth across Sun Wukong's aura more than a dozen times. Blood spurted out of Zero's lips as he tanked the hit. His face ran flush with blood as his body reconciled the impact, nearly causing the powerful lion to fall unconscious. 8 of his ribs were broken, and all of the other ones were cracked. His left lung had been punctured, and most of his organs had sustained serious damage, all from a single blow. Despite the vicious injuries he'd sustained, as Zero managed to force himself to fall to a halt, a blood-soaked smile appeared on his face. For he was not the only one injured in that exchange. Chapter 229 Eyes. Sun Wukong held up his right hand, examining it coolly. All the way from his lower shoulder down to his fingertips, blood-red lines could be seen, set right next to horrible, black and badly burned skin. His entire right arm had been completely ruined, annihilated almost beyond recognition. You dared to touch my full-strength annihilation energy with your bare hands. Zero's words came out wheezing. The man snorted harshly when he noticed this. He promptly punched his own chest, forcibly inflating his injured lung as he returned to speaking at a normal level. His body was currently in ruins, but the fact that he had virtually infinite energy meant it was automatically repairing itself. The personification of annihilation itself. You will never move that arm, Agai. Zero's voice brutally cut off. Before the divine golden lion's very eyes, Sun Wukong raised his right arm up, flexing his fingers as he casually yawned. It did sting a little. It will probably take me a couple of days to fully recover. No, that isn't possible. Zero's voice contained a hint of shock and horror as he saw this, looking at Sun Wukong as if he was a freakish monster. I annihilated the essence of your arm. It is burnt from the fabric of existence itself. That's impossible. He gazed at the monkey with a look in his eye that hinged on insanity, as if this action was making him question his own sanity. I can't, that isn't possible. Zero's eyes glowed bright red again as he rushed forward, ignoring everything else as he blasted towards Sun Wukong. The energy he had gathered around himself was abruptly fully thrown forward into his sword, abandoning all attempts at defense as he threw everything he had for one final attack. If Zero had been paying careful attention to his surroundings, he would have noticed the aura Sun Wukong gave off shivering slightly every time the monkey moved his burnt arm. He might have even seen the aura of light condensing slightly under Sun Wukong's arm, twisting in odd, puppeteering-like ways. If he hadn't been so caught up on Sun Wukong's casual expression and words, he might even have noticed that, for a brief moment, Sun Wukong's body had shivered in shock, as if he had just taken an extremely serious injury. However, a perfect storm of coincidences had led to a perfect situation where everything went in just the direction that Zero missed all of this. As Zero rushed in at Sun Wukong, the monkey gazed at the incoming attacker with a sense of resignation. His eyes gleamed as he raised his uninjured left hand and tapped on his heart. Release the second seal. Life condense. Sun Wukong's vast aura shivered, and then vanished completely. The change was so abrupt, Dorian's jaw fell open in shock when he noticed it. The sheer speed in which the aura vanished in totality was incredibly jarring, blindingly noticeable even to anomalies that were off to the side. A hint of confusion appeared in Zero's gaze, but none of his ferocity faded as he shot through the air. In just a fraction of a second, he arrived in front of Sun Wukong. Zero's sword swung down like a planet collapsing as it crashed down. This attack was fueled by the very essence of annihilation itself. Sun Wukong raised his left hand to meet that sword, and, without any fanfare, the two collided. Whosh! The world seemed to freeze. In one moment, Zero's sword was about to split Sun Wukong and the ground behind him for miles in twain. In the next, Sun Wukong caught Zero's full-powered, all-out attack with merely 2 fingers. There was no explosion of force, no shockwave or grand impact. Instead, there was merely stillness as the force of Zero's attack seemed to dissipate. The red annihilation energy vanished as if it had never existed. Zero's mouth trembled as the sword he had formed vanished, falling apart into nothingness. His gaze took on unknown emotion as he looked at Sun Wukong silently, saying nothing. Sun Wukong gazed back, a sad look appearing in his eyes. "Child," he shook his head, "you will never defeat me." Find authorized novels in Webnovel. Faster updates, better experience. Please click www.webnovel.com for visiting. Zero stumbled back as he heard that, his breath coming in rapidly as the impact of today's fight began to sink in. His body was in tatters, extremely heavily injured while facing an opponent that struck fear to his very core. As the divine golden lion realized that, he abruptly jumped backwards more than 100 meters. "Lion, if you cannot defeat me, how can you hope to defeat him?" "I'll tell you now." Sun Wukong's voice took back its grand air. "He defeated me when I was in my prime." These words seemed to sink into Zero's very soul as he looked at Sun Wukong. And, right after that, he fled. Whoosh! The air around him seemed to scream as he tore open a hole in reality. A small, forest glade was revealed, alongside a warm, sunny sky. The second-born didn't wait to respond to Sun Wukong as he retreated, throwing himself through to the other side with a sense of urgency. Before that magical portal shut, Sun Wukong yelled out one last phrase, words full of menace and majesty. "These anomalies are under my protection. The next time you come for them, child, I will kill you myself. Do not mistake my mercy for weakness." Whoosh! The portal shut as Zero made his escape. A half-second after that, Sun Wukong's body shook. Blood dripped out of his eyes, his ears, and his mouth as he stood absolutely still. If one looked closely at him, at that exact moment, it would be possible to see his skin itself writhing, as if he was in pure, unadulterated agony. For all that he gave off the image of a godly warrior, Sun Wukong's almighty power had a major flaw. Many years ago, he had been mortally injured, not by an enemy or a mistake he made in cultivation, but instead by a man he trusted and loved as a friend. Ukeli betrayed him. By all rights, Sun Wukong should be dead. The injuries he'd suffered had permanently damaged his soul itself. Despite that, he stuck around, not because he wanted to, but because he felt he had to. For he knew that one day Ukeli would be back. And the world would not understand that man like he did. Not even Arthur truly understood Ukeli. But Sun Wukong did, and he knew that he would be needed. For it was what Asura would have done. Whenever Sun Wukong used any of his seals, he would experience a huge amount of backlash. The more seals he used, the bigger the backlash. Right now, he had been forced to use all but his last, final seal. As a result, the backlash he suffered was something that would have driven a lesser being insane. Every single cell in his body seemed to be rebelling, his insides twisting and ravaged by energy. However, he was not immobilized, nor was he powerless. In the end, the agony he was undergoing was just that. Agony. The pain was blinding, but he could deal with it as long as he had strength. The monkey looked down at his body, shock coloring his tone as he walked back over to where Dorian and the others were. "I can see only a little bit more, I should be about to die." My old injuries have risen up and I've strained my body far beyond what I should as a result. But, the monkey shook his head. I feel fine? Sun Wukong looked down at his hands in genuine surprise. Well, he didn't feel fine. He felt awful, but he certainly didn't feel like he was about to die. Dorian caught the back half of Sun Wukong's statement, his eyes lighting up as he heard Sun Wukong proclaim he was fine. That's great news. He slowly stood up, smiling at the odd monkey. He had met Sun Wukong before, but couldn't possibly have expected the warrior would reappear here and save him. Dorian was still getting over his shock at the abrupt reversal. As Dorian spoke, a plain-looking gray humanoid stepped between Dorian and Sun Wukong silently. Both of them ignored the gray creature completely as the being walked up in front of the exhausted monkey. Yes, young Dorian, you will not hear me disagreeing. Sun Wukong smiled at Dorian. The monkey winced slightly as he looked at his burnt right arm. The arm was dead and lame as it could be, showing not even the slightest hint of movement. Dorian took a deep breath before he spoke again, a wave of exhaustion and pain hitting him. He forced himself to stay conscious, steadily drawing upon various laws to help recover as he continued. You have my utmost gratitude, Lord Wukong. I truly thought I would die today. Dorian bowed his head towards the monkey. As he spoke, he felt something slightly odd, an unsettling feeling that he couldn't quite place, at the edge of his mind. He didn't feel like he was in any danger, nor did he sense any ill intent. As a result, the feeling vanished, but he took notice of it, keeping his eyes alert as he scanned the surroundings. When he didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, he continued on. I couldn't fully take in your battle with Zero. He had been focused much more on healing himself than the outside world. What exactly too? Before he could finish his sentence, he froze as he witnessed something horrifying. A plain, unassuming gray-skinned humanoid appeared, shimmering into existence before his very eyes. A creature that Dorian himself was very familiar with. A gray manter, beings that had the ability to step outside of fate itself. This creature appeared right in front of the exhausted figure of Sun Wukong. Before Dorian could process this, before Sun Wukong could react, before anyone or anything could make even the slightest movements, Mello tore out Sun Wukong's eyes. Chapter 230 Revelation. The raw brutality of the surprise attack horrified Dorian. Sun Wukong's eyes were covered in a layer of green energy as Mello tore them out. The moment they were ripped free, the world seemed to scream in agony as the eyeballs transformed into two glowing orbs of white energy. A heart-rending sensation of pain flooded Dorian's soul as he felt this, nearly knocking him unconscious. This sensation seemed to impact everyone here, even Mello. All of the other anomalies winced and fell backwards, several of Mello's allies collapsing. Dorian was forced down to his knees, largely because he was still recovering from the battle with Zero. Mello merely grunted, as if he had been expecting this. He jumped backwards a dozen meters after securing the two glowing orbs, covering them up protectively. Sun Wukong, in the meanwhile, fell down to one knee, blood spurting up from his lips. His aura fluctuated wildly, becoming incredibly weak, more so than it already was from his injured state. Mello, what have you done? Dorian fought against the fog that clouded his mind as he threw off the pain, spinning to face the anomaly angrily. The air around him trembled as he jumped between Sun Wukong and his attacker, glaring at Mello. Mello was staring intensely at the two orbs, focusing on them as if preparing something. He replied to Dorian without breaking that focus. I did him a favor, in a way. These eyes were killing him. You could say that I have saved his life. Dorian blinked and turned back to look at Sun Wukong. The monkey was still on one knee, the aura around him still very weak. A line of blood dripped down from his lips as he sat frozen. How can you call that saving? Dorian spun back, his voice still laced with anger. As Dorian spoke, he put his full focus on recovering his strength as fast as possible. He had never fully trusted Mello. After all, the anomaly had even attacked him before. However, considering how they had worked together last time, he had at least gained some modicum of trust for the anomaly. The fact that the anomaly showed up here with help had originally solidified that. This incident, however, served as a stiff reminder. Mello would act and do whatever he thought he needed to do, regardless of Dorian's opinion. His thin level of trust for Mello promptly dissipated, causing him to view everything the anomaly said with suspicion. Give it a few minutes, brother. He's greatly overdrawn the power of his soul spell matrix, and his soul in general, especially given the dire injuries his soul already bore. Mello held the two glowing white orbs in one hand as he raised his other hand and gestured at Dorian and Sun Wukong. I know you can hear me, even if you can't respond, monkey. I'm sure you're feeling pretty confused right now, Mello smiled slightly. After all of those permanent injuries to the soul you had, they should all be regenerating now, right? Dorian's eyes widened slightly when he heard that. He glanced back at Sun Wukong again. Now that he looked closely, he could faintly tell that Sun Wukong had entered a state of meditation. While his aura was incredibly weak, Dorian could just faintly tell that the monkey was in some type of healing state. Mello continued to speak as he studied the two glowing orbs. The injuries you suffered to your soul were never permanent. The energy you spent to keep yourself stable should have been used to heal you. After all, Ukeli is powerful, but to cripple your soul, an angelic class soul, for 1,000 years? Mello gestured with his wrist, as if such a suggestion was ludicrous. A tired, sardonic voice echoed out, one that caused Dorian to spin around, again, as he looked back at Sun Wukong. Is that so, young one? Sun Wukong crossed his legs as he fully sat down, assuming a better meditative pose. Despite his lack of eyes, he stared straight at Mello. He didn't look angry or mad, but rather, tired. Indeed, it was these eyes that kept you crippled. They grant incredible powers but have costs of their own. Mello returned smoothly. These eyes were never meant for mortal bodies. When they are born in a mortal frame, they divinely envelop parts of your soul, forever preventing any type of soul healing so long as they exist. Dorian blinked as he heard this explanation, slowly putting together the pieces, assuming Mello wasn't lying. Mello went on. It was never Ukeli's attacks that kept you crippled, but parts of yourself that even these eyes did not let you see. Mello's smile widened a fraction as he finished. You know I'm right. You can feel it now, can't you? You're an angelic class being. How many creatures alive could possibly injure your soul? Only Ukeli, and yourself, when you overdraw on it. All the injuries you've accumulated over the years were always healable. Mello repeated himself slightly, reinforcing his points. Sun Wukong sat in silence for several seconds. His aura, Dorian noted, was gradually increasing in power. Whether or not Mello was speaking the whole truth, it seemed that at least part of what he said was being proven, here and now. I find myself astonished at your breadth of knowledge. I suppose I must thank you for the overwhelming care you have shown me. A sardonic grin appeared on Sun Wukong's face. Despite the loss of his eyes, Sun Wukong seemed faintly relieved. Oh, it's not me you should be thanking. A smile appeared on Mello's face as he waved his free hand once more. It's her. Whoosh. A body appeared, landing in Mello's free arm. A calm, peaceful aura enveloped the world as soon as that body appeared, washing over everyone present. Dorian felt his soul resonate slightly at first. It was a small, petite body of a clearly dead woman. Even in death, the woman was clearly beautiful. She had long, flowing silver hair, and a gentle smile that graced her face. When Dorian saw her, he felt as if his entire soul was on fire, the slight resonation exploding into a torrent of emotion. An incredible feeling of longing swept through him as he looked at that body. But that feeling wasn't coming from him. Asra? He muttered in his soul. Yes. Quietly, the soul spell matrix genie replied. Who is that? The feeling of longing was coming from the genie, somehow. A certain suspicion began to lodge itself in Dorian's mind. Asra was silent for a time, something that was very unusual. The genie wasn't a true consciousness, and was far closer to an eye of sorts than anything else. Its replies were often automatic, and very rarely would they take a long moment. However, she still responded in the end. That body once held the soul spell matrix I was formed from. Dorian's eyes widened as he heard that. In that same moment, Sun Wukong froze completely, his body turned towards Asra's original body. The monkey leaned forward, as if he was about to jump at her with all of his might, and was just barely holding himself back. What are you doing? Sun Wukong's voice was dangerously calm as he faced Mello. I'm merely using something that was prepared long ago. As Mello spoke, the various anomalies that had traveled here with him surrounded him in a protective layer. A multitude of powerful auras blazed into the air as they prevented anyone from interfering. Among that group, Both Zaffin and Aaron, anomalies Dorian knew, stood stalwart with Mello. Dorian made eye contact with them, staring at them in disbelief. The duo shook their heads silently, not offering an explanation. He could feel their determination, even if he couldn't understand their actions. "You never knew, did you?" As Mello spoke, he slowly brought the two glowing orbs over to float in front of the dead woman's face. "Knew what?" Sun Wukong replied slowly. His words still carried a hint of danger within them, despite his obviously weakened state. It was a feeling that made Dorian's neck shiver, a feeling of buried killing intent that threatened to swarm and overwhelm everyone present. "The kind lady that picked you up and trained you, selflessly raising you and teaching you the ways of the world." Mello's voice became rather sarcastic. "You thought you could trust her?" He shook his head. "Trust is a commodity the weak can never truly have." Mello's voice deepened to a growl. Before Sun Wukong could respond, Mello continued. "She didn't take you in out of the kindness of her heart. She took you in because of your eyes." Sun Wukong simply shrugged, unperturbed. "Of course, they were what made me unique at the time. Without them, I would have been but a regular monkey." "No, Lord Wukong, she took you in because of your eyes." Mello raised up her body briefly. For years, she began to purify and prepare her body, researching those eyes. Her unique constitution as a wise jade dragon allowed her to stabilize many types of energy. Through experimentation on herself, she began to adapt her body so that it could maintain its purity and control no matter what energy it needed to conduct. As Mello spoke, Sun Wukong listened silently. Dorian, in the meanwhile, continued to glare at Aaron and Zaffin, trying to demand a silent explanation while he regenerated. "And do you know why, monkey?" Mello finished, smiling sardonically. Sun Wukong didn't reply, but Mello seemed to take that as a response to continue. "Because she was interested in a pair of eyes. But if she wanted to take those eyes for herself, her body would need to be able to handle them perfectly. After all, the transfer of something so divine would put a huge amount of strain on someone's soul." Mello added two last lines. "From the moment she met you, monkey, she was plotting against you. The woman you view as a hero, the woman you looked up to, was a woman that planned to betray you from the very start." His words contained a hint of satisfaction and venom, as if he was revealing a truth that validated his own beliefs. The air seemed to freeze over as Mello finished speaking. Even Dorian froze, looking back at Mello in shock as he heard all of this. "Osra, is that true?" he mentally queried. His image of the wise lady had always been a positive one. He could hardly believe Mello was speaking the truth. Osra didn't reply. Sun Wukong, however, did, after waiting for a couple of seconds. "I judge a being not by their words, but by their actions." He spoke slowly, but with confidence so unshakable it was difficult to fathom. "You can't be serious." Mello shook his head slightly as he replied, eyeing Sun Wukong. "That woman based your entire friendship on the fact that she wanted to betray you, and you find nothing wrong with that?" His tone became rather cutting. "I cannot speak for her motives, nor for the truth of your words." "But," Sun Wukong began, his voice still unshakably confident, "she had every opportunity to act against me. And yet, she did not. Indeed, had she asked me to give up these eyes, I would have been the first to oblige. The care she showed me is not something that can be faked." Sun Wukong shook his head. "I have never viewed her as a perfect being. We are all flawed, one and all. I will not judge her for mistakes and desires that she never acted on, if what you say is true at all." Sun Wukong finished with one final line. "No one is perfect." Mello didn't seem to be angered. He just shrugged, silently, as if he hadn't expected anything different. Only Dorian was able to catch the faint hint of disappointment in Mello's gaze, largely thanks to his association with the anomaly, but also because of the fact that Dorian still had eyes. "A man exists that would disagree with that sentiment," Mello returned. "He, of all people, should know it best." Sun Wukong sighed, sounding like an elderly man that wanted nothing more than to sit down and rest, to let go of the burden he bore. In the time the duo had been talking, Mello had brought the eyes he stole from Sun Wukong all the way to Osra's face. Light had begun to concentrate around Osra's body, causing the nearby air to warp slightly. This light sent waves throughout the world, causing Dorian to shiver once more as his soul seemed to burn. Sun Wukong stood still throughout, though likely not of his own will. Sun Wukong hit it well, but Dorian could tell that the monkey was close to collapse. Dorian wasn't in too much better of a shape. Right after that, Mello finished his preparations. A bright flash of white light blinded the air. An instant later, an odd, pale gray cocoon of some type of fabric wrapped around Asra's body and the two eyes, sealing them out of sight. Not a moment later, the cocooned body vanished, disappearing as if it never was. Lord Wukong, your gift, willing or not, will not go unused. Mello's voice was tinged with exhaustion and a hint of victory as he smiled. Just as you have now broken free from the shackles that bound your soul, I will break free from the shackles that bind all of us. Mello gestured at the anomalies that stood with him, as well as at Dorian. Right after, he also sharply gestured at his men. Immediately, they began to retreat, ignoring Sun Wukong and Dorian. Zafin and Aaron refused to make further eye contact with Dorian, looking away. You are blinded by your own arrogance, young one. You have put yourself onto a path of ruin. Sun Wukong replied sadly, he cannot be defeated in a direct battle. He simply can't, with my eyes or not. A hint of despair colored Sun Wukong's voice. That would presume I will fight fair. Mello retreated with the other anomalies, never looking back as they began to trudge away from the cratered earth, heading towards one of the exits to the underground cave system. Find authorized novels in WebNovel, faster updates, better experience. Please click www.webnovel.com for visiting. Just like that, Mello and his allies left, all of them transforming into various flying forms as they soared off into the distance. The truth of your words. Sun Wukong let out a long sigh. I have pondered how to defeat that man for 1,000 years, young one, and still do not have an answer. You may have more eyes than I, but you do not truly see. Right after he said that, Sun Wukong collapsed to the ground, his soul forcing him into unconsciousness as it shut down to focus on healing from the grievous injuries he'd accumulated over 1,000 years. His words sailed out as a fading echo, solemn and filled with sadness. Dorian rushed forward and caught the monkey before he fully fell, easing him to the ground. He checked Sun Wukong's condition, noting that the powerful warrior was recovering, but at a slow rate and completely unable to defend himself. Thud, thud. Dorian looked up from Sun Wukong, his eyes narrowing as he heard some quiet thuds in the background. A large horde of Greycons were relentlessly approaching the mostly obliterated center of the city. The number of undead creatures had truly built up to a horrific count, drawn in by the fearsome battle. Dorian coughed, his eyes going slightly red as he glared at the enemies. His body and soul were in no condition to do battle. As he was about to change forms, however, he winced, and abruptly changed his mind. His soul still felt incredibly off balance thanks to Asra's old body's appearance, as well as the injuries he'd sustained. The hex that Zero had used to force him into remaining in a single form had not fully been thrown off due to his weakened state. His eyes darted to and fro as he scanned his surroundings. The body of the frozen giant had long since been blown to ash. There were no easy ways to get to anything like a high ground nearby. He had a few artifacts that might help out, but he didn't want to risk simply levitating to the exposed roof up above unless he had to. Sun Wukong needed a safe place to rest, as did he. After a second, however, he noticed a collapsed area of stone that he slightly recognized. Memories of a secret, underground building where a powerful, king-class Greycon had lived, and a betrayal he had suffered at the hands of a certain Lightsworn fox. With only one more glance at the